There is a city that should not exist. It sits below the level of the sea, built on ground so soft and wet that the first people who tried to live there were told, by every reasonable measure of the ancient world, that they had chosen the wrong place. The land shifted beneath their feet. The rivers flooded without warning. The peat dissolved when you walked on it. The wind came off the water, cold and grey and unrelenting, and nothing about the place suggested permanence. And yet, from that improbable beginning, on a stretch of marsh at the mouth of a small river that hardly anyone had heard of, there would rise a city so wealthy, so strange, so completely unlike anything the world had seen before, that merchants from China would know its name. Philosophers would call it the freest city on earth. Artists would produce works there that people still stand before, 400 years later, trying to understand what they are seeing. Amsterdam, a word that started as a description of a dam on the river Amstel, a name that became something else entirely, a kind of miracle really, a city that refused the logic of its own geography and built an empire not from conquest, but from trade, not from gold mines, but from the movement of things, not from the force of kings, but from the energy of ordinary people who needed somewhere to go. This is the story of how that happened, all of it, from the very beginning, when there was nothing here but water and mud, and a few desperate families doing what desperate families do, finding a way. Before we go further, I want to take a moment. If you found this video, if you are settling in right now and letting the world go quiet around you, I am glad you are here. These are long stories told slowly, because some things deserve to be told that way. The history of Amsterdam is one of them. It is not a simple story. It does not move in a straight line. It bends and floods and dries out and floods again, just like the land it was built on. I will take you through all of it. The early fishermen and the dam, the herring, the grain trade. The moment Amsterdam became, almost by accident, the financial center of the world. The golden age, when more paintings were made per capita in this one city than anywhere else in human history. The slow decline, the things that were lost, and the questions that remain, the way they always do, sitting quietly at the edge of what we know. If you are watching this to fall asleep, that is exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where are you right now and what time is it. Before Amsterdam, there was only the Delta. The Rhine and the Meuse and the Scheldt came down from the interior of Europe and spilled out into the North Sea through a maze of channels and islands and shifting sandbanks that cartographers would spend centuries trying to accurately draw. It was not a static landscape, it was a landscape in motion. The sea pushed in, the rivers pushed back. The ground between them was neither fully land nor fully water, but something in between, a category the early inhabitants of Northern Europe had no single word for because it had no single stable form. The Romans came here and wrote about it with a mixture of admiration and horror. Pliny the Elder, who would later die watching Vesuvius destroy Pompeii, described the people of the coastal lowlands as living in a condition he found almost impossible to classify. They built their homes on artificial mounds, he wrote, mounds they raised above the flood level by piling up earth and debris and whatever else they could find. When the sea came in, these mounds became islands. When it withdrew, they became hills in a flat, waterlogged plain. The people on them were neither fully on land nor fully at sea. They existed in a condition of permanent negotiation with a landscape that never agreed to be one thing. These people were the ancestors of what would become the Dutch. Not a single tribe or nation, but a collection of related groups living along the coastal margins of what the Romans called Germania Inferior, the lower Germanic territories. They fished. They grazed cattle on the salt marshes when the ground was firm enough. They harvested reeds and used them to thatch the low roofs of their houses. They made salt by burning peat and rinsing the ash through seawater. They traded along the river systems that connected the coast to the interior. They were practical people, as you would have to be to live where they lived. And practicality was the first quality that Amsterdam, centuries later, would make its founding virtue. The Romans built a frontier here, a series of forts along the Rhine that were meant to mark the edge of their world. The northern lowlands, beyond that frontier, they largely left alone, partly because there was nothing there that Rome particularly wanted, and partly because the terrain made organized military occupation almost impossibly difficult. You cannot march a legion through a swamp. The roads that held Rome together could not be built on ground that refused to stay solid. When Rome withdrew, as it eventually did from all its northern frontiers, the Low Country was left to fill itself in. Germanic groups came from the east. The Frisians held the coastal strip for centuries, building a culture and a language and a set of seafaring traditions that would contribute in essential ways to what the Dutch would eventually become. The Frisians were traders. They moved along the North Sea coast in flat-bottomed boats, carrying goods between the ports and the river mouths, developing the commercial infrastructure that would later be elaborated into something magnificent. The Saxons settled further south and east, tougher farming country, but country that at least stayed solid beneath your feet. The Franks came eventually and built the beginnings of what would become France and the Low Countries under a single, if perpetually unstable, political authority. Charlemagne made the Low Country part of his empire in the late 8th century, and for a while, the region was organized enough to produce its own bishops and monasteries, and the first tentative beginnings of towns. The monasteries matter here more than they might at first seem to. The monasteries of the Low Country were not simply religious institutions. They were the primary centers of learning and record-keeping in a world where literacy was rare and books were precious. The monks who lived in them drained the surrounding land and farmed it and kept accounts of what they produced. They built infrastructure, channels and dikes and mills that transformed the immediate landscape, and that was often maintained by the lay communities that grew up around the monastic estates. The monastic network was, among other things, a network of practical knowledge about how to manage wet land, and that knowledge was passed down through generations of farmers and craftsmen who learned from the monks and then taught their own children. But the towns were small, and the landscape was still the landscape, still wet, still shifting, still not, by any conventional measure, a promising place to build a city. The area that would become Amsterdam was, around the year 1000, not a settlement at all. It was a stretch of peat bog at the mouth of a river called the Amstel, which drained south through the flat land of what is now the Dutch province of North Holland, and emptied into a large tidal inlet called the IJ, which itself connected to the Zuiderzee, the great inland sea that occupied the center of what is now the Netherlands. Nothing was here, just water and bog, and the reeds that grew wherever the ground was damp enough to support them, which was almost everywhere. And then, sometime in the 12th century, people came. The landscape that would eventually produce Amsterdam had been shaped by forces operating over timescales that make human history look brief. The North Sea basin itself was, 12,000 years ago, dry land. The Great Plain that connected what is now Britain to what is now the Netherlands was inhabited by hunters who followed reindeer and aurochs through a landscape of tundra and birch forest. The rivers that are now submerged under the southern North Sea were once real rivers, flowing north through a populated land. Archaeologists have recovered from the seabed the bones of the animals those hunters pursued, and occasionally the tools they used, dredged up by fishing nets and deposited in the museums of the coastal towns where the fishing boats came home. The Mesolithic inhabitants of what would become the Netherlands lived in a world that was changing faster than any previous generation of humanity had experienced. The warming that followed the last glacial maximum was not gradual and even but lurching and irregular, marked by periods of rapid change that turned grassland into forest and redirected rivers and raised the sea level by dozens of meters over centuries. The people who lived through these changes adapted, moving with the animals and the seasons, learning to work the new landscapes as they emerged. The Frisians, who would occupy the coastal lowlands through the early medieval period, and who would contribute so much to the commercial and maritime culture that eventually produced Amsterdam, were themselves the descendants of these adaptive communities, mixed with the farmers who had come to the region from the southeast during the Neolithic period. The mixing produced people well suited to the landscape they occupied, people who understood both the sea and the agricultural potential of the land behind the dunes, people whose culture was organized around the practical management of a difficult environment. The Frisian trading network of the early medieval period was extensive. Frisian merchants traveled from the Rhine Delta to England, to Scandinavia, to the Frankish interior, carrying goods that connected the northern European world in ways that the later Hanseatic League would organize more formally, but did not fundamentally invent. The great Frisian trading emporium of Dorestad, which flourished in the 7th and 8th centuries near the junction of the Rhine and the Lech, was one of the largest trading settlements in early medieval northern Europe. Goods from as far as the Mediterranean and the Baltic passed through it. The Frisian merchants who ran this trade were not primitive tribesmen, but sophisticated commercial operators who maintained credit relationships across hundreds of miles and who understood the logistics of moving perishable, non-perishable goods by river and sea. When the Vikings raided and ultimately destroyed Dorestad in the 9th century, they disrupted a commercial network that had been building for generations. But they did not destroy the underlying commercial culture. The knowledge and the habits of trade that the Frisians had developed survived in the coastal communities that rebuilt after the raids, and they were available to be absorbed into the new political and commercial structures that the Carolingian Empire and its successors were building across the Low Country. The monasteries that Charlemagne and his successors planted across the Low Country were, among other things, the institutions through which this practical knowledge was organized and transmitted. The monks who drained the marshes around their foundations were not simply doing agricultural work. They were creating the institutional models for landscape management that lay communities would later adopt and formalize. The polders, the drainage districts, the systems of sluices and weirs and channels that organized the water in the Low Country were first worked out in embryonic form in the experimental agricultural projects of the early medieval monasteries. The word polder itself is Dutch, and it describes something that has no exact equivalent in most other languages because the thing it describes is not found in most other landscapes. A polder is a piece of land that has been reclaimed from the water and that is maintained below sea level by an active drainage system. It is not simply drained land. It is land that continues to require human management to remain land. Remove the pumps, break the dikes, and the polder returns to water. The polder is a permanent commitment, a piece of landscape that exists only because human beings agree to maintain it, generation after generation, indefinitely. This quality, the ongoing necessity of collective maintenance, is what made the polder landscape so formative for Dutch culture. You cannot build a polder and then forget about it. You cannot let your neighbour's section of the dike fail without affecting your own land. The system requires constant cooperation, constant vigilance, and a political structure that can enforce the contributions of all the people whose land is protected by the shared infrastructure. The waterschap, the water board, was the institution that provided this structure, and its habits of collective decision-making and shared responsibility were the deep foundation on which everything that Amsterdam would later build was constructed. The windmill, which became the defining visual symbol of the Dutch landscape, was not primarily a picturesque feature. It was a pump. The tower mills and the polder mills that dotted the flat landscape of the Low Country were drainage machines, their sails turning in the coastal wind to drive the screw pumps and paddle wheels that lifted water from the drainage channels and moved it up and over the dike walls into the canals and rivers that carried it out to sea. Without the windmills, the polders would flood. Without the polders, much of what is now the Netherlands would be underwater. The windmill was not decoration, it was survival, engineered and maintained and operated by the people whose lives depended on it. The engineering tradition that produced the windmill and the polder and the dike was not the engineering of courts and great patrons. It was the engineering of communities managing shared problems with the resources available to them. Dutch hydraulic engineering was practical, iterative, and driven by the specific conditions of specific places rather than by abstract theory. The men who built the dikes and managed the waterboards in the 13th and 14th centuries were not university-trained engineers. They were farmers and craftsmen who had learned from their fathers and their grandfathers and from the consequences of their own mistakes, and whose accumulated knowledge was embodied in the landscape they had shaped. They came because the peat was there. This sounds like an odd reason to choose a place to live, but peat was not simply a nuisance to the early medieval Dutch. It was fuel. It was building material. It was the substance that kept you warm through a North Sea winter, which was a thing worth taking seriously. Communities had been digging peat out of the low country for centuries, cutting it in blocks and drying it and burning it, and the process had consequences that would not become fully apparent until it was too late to stop them. When you remove peat from the ground, the remaining surface compresses. It dries slightly, oxidizes, and sinks. The Dutch word for this is bodemdeling, land subsidence, and it was happening across the low country on a scale that no individual farmer or fisherman could have fully perceived. Each generation lived on ground that was a little lower than the ground of the previous generation. The sea, which had never been a comfortable neighbor, was becoming slowly more threatening. What had been marginal land was becoming land that needed to be actively defended, and so people began to build dikes. This is such a fundamental fact of Dutch history that it risks becoming a cliché, the story of a people forever holding back the sea. But the reality of what early medieval Dutch communities were doing when they built dikes was something more interesting and more complicated than simple defense. They were reorganizing the landscape. They were taking a dynamic, unpredictable environment and imposing a kind of order on it. Not the order of conquest, because you cannot conquer water. The order of management, of ongoing, daily, never finished negotiation. The dike is a commitment, not a wall in the way that the walls of a city or a fortress are walls. Barriers built against an enemy that can be defeated and driven away. A dike requires constant maintenance. The water that it holds back is not defeated. It is perpetually held at bay by the perpetual attention of the people whose lives depend on the dike's integrity. The moment that attention lapses, the moment a section of the dike is allowed to weaken or erode, the water comes back. It always comes back. This is not a problem that can be solved once and forgotten. It is a condition of existence that must be managed every day, by every generation, without end. This created something unusual in the social organization of the Low Country. The dike required collective action. A single landowner could not build or maintain a dike that protected a stretch of coastline or a length of riverbank. The work was too large and the benefit too widely shared. Everyone whose land sat behind the dike had an interest in its maintenance. Everyone whose land was at risk, if the dike failed, had reason to contribute to keeping it sound. Out of this necessity grew the waterschap, the water board. This was a collective institution, older than almost any other form of organized government in the Low Country, created for the sole purpose of managing the water that was always threatening to reclaim the land from the people who had labored to keep it dry. The water board was governed by its members, the landowners whose property it protected, and its decisions were made collectively because the alternative was collective disaster. Here is something that historians of Dutch culture have noted repeatedly, and that deserves to stay with you as the rest of this story unfolds. The people who would eventually build the most sophisticated financial markets in the history of the world, who would develop the first publicly traded shares and the first central bank and the first true bond market, were also the descendants of people who had learned, centuries earlier, that survival required cooperation and that the individual who put their own interests above the collective's need for a functioning dike was a danger to everyone. The practical democracy of the water board preceded the political philosophy of the Dutch Golden Age by many centuries. The philosophy came later to explain and justify what the necessity had already created. The Amstel River was diked sometime in the late 12th or very early 13th century. The exact date is uncertain, as it almost always is with the infrastructure of ordinary medieval life, which left fewer records than the acts of kings and bishops. But the physical evidence is clear enough. A dam was built across the Amstel where it met the IJ. This dam controlled the flow of water in both directions. It prevented the tidal saltwater of the IJ from flooding up the river and ruining the freshwater meadows to the south. And it created a calm basin where boats coming in from the sea could anchor and be loaded and unloaded without fighting the current. A dam on the Amstel, in Dutch, Amstelredam, which became, in time, Amsterdam. The people who built this dam and began living beside it were not merchants or artists or philosophers. They were fishermen and farmers working a difficult landscape with the tools available to them in the 13th century. They built wooden houses on the damp ground close to the river. They fished the IJ for the herring and eels and other fish that the tidal waters brought. They grazed cattle on the meadows upriver when the season allowed. They were ordinary people in an ordinary, small, wet settlement. But the dam changed things. A dam at the meeting point of a river and a coastal inlet is, among other things, a toll point. Anything moving between the sea and the interior of the land has to stop here or go around. And going around costs time and effort and money. So stopping here, paying a toll, using the lock or the portage or whatever arrangement the dam's owners provided was usually the practical choice. Trade routes follow geography, and the geography of the Amstel Dam put it on a route between the Baltic Sea, where grain and timber and fish moved in enormous quantities, and the Rhineland and the low country interior, where those goods were consumed. This is the moment, understated and logistical and completely undramatic, when Amsterdam's future was decided, not by a conquering king or a visionary founder, but by the accident of a dam in the right place, at the right moment, in the movement of Northern European trade. The goods that moved through this place in the 13th century were not exotic. They were the basic commodities of medieval Northern European life. Grain, above all. Rye and wheat and barley coming down from the agricultural regions of the Baltic coast, grown in the deep fertile soils of what is now Poland and the Baltic states, harvested by peasant farmers and loaded onto ships and moved west to the cities and towns that could not grow enough for themselves. Timber from the same Baltic forests, the massive old-growth trees that were being felled to build houses and ships, and the barrels in which everything was transported. Fish, herring and cod, the protein of a Catholic world that fasted on 150 days of the year. Salt, going the other direction, imported from the Atlantic coast to preserve the fish and the meat that would otherwise spoil before it could be consumed. All of this moved through the dam on the Amstel, and the people who lived beside the dam collected their toll and loaded and unloaded and stored and shipped and slowly, generation by generation, built something out of the geography they had inherited. The count who controlled this stretch of the Low Country in the early 13th century was a man named Gijsbrecht van Amstel, and the settlement at the dam was part of his territory. Medieval Dutch lords were not exactly the castle-dwelling feudal kings of popular imagination. They were more like managers of complicated, watery estates, constantly negotiating between their peasants and farmers below them and the more powerful lords above them, including the bishops of Utrecht and later the counts of Holland. The bishops of Utrecht had claimed ecclesiastical and some temporal authority over the lower river regions for centuries, and the relationship between the bishops, the local lords, and the increasingly assertive counts of Holland was perpetually tangled. The counts of Holland had been consolidating power over the Low Country for several generations, and the small settlement at the Amstel Dam was, from their perspective, a promising piece of territory to bring firmly within their sphere. In 1275, Count Floris V of Holland granted the people of Amsterdam a toll privilege. This document, one of the oldest surviving references to the settlement by name, was not a grand founding charter. It was a practical exemption. The people living at the Amstel Dam were excused from paying certain tolls when their goods moved through the county. The Latin text of the document refers to the men dwelling near the Amstel Dam, and the specificity of the reference tells us that this was already a recognizable place with a recognizable population. The toll exemption was an incentive designed to attract trade and thereby increase the economic activity that the count could tax. It worked. The settlement grew. By the end of the 13th century, Amsterdam had grown enough to have a church, the Oude Kerk, the Old Church, whose foundations were being laid on a small piece of relatively firm ground near the river. Churches were markers of permanence in the medieval world. A community that built a permanent church believed it was going to stay. Amsterdam was staying. The church was dedicated to Saint Nicholas, the patron saint of sailors and merchants, which tells you something about who its congregation was and what they did for a living. The Oude Kerk was not a grand cathedral. It was a modest wooden structure at first, rebuilt in stone over the following century as the community grew and its ambitions with it. It occupied a low mound near the river, the kind of slightly elevated ground that was precious in this landscape, and it became the gravitational center of the early settlement. the point around which the rest of the growing town organized itself. And then something happened that had nothing to do with dams, or toll privileges, or the counts of Holland. Something happened with a fish. The herring is a small, oily silver fish that moves in enormous schools through the cold waters of the North Sea and the Baltic. It has been eaten in Northern Europe for as long as Northern Europeans have existed, salted and dried and smoked and pickled and consumed in vast quantities by populations that were often chronically short of protein. Medieval fasting requirements meant that fish was eaten on something like half the days of the year across Catholic Europe. The market for preserved fish was enormous and essentially permanent. For most of the medieval period, the center of the herring trade was the Baltic. The fish spawned in the western Baltic near the Swedish coast, around a region called Scania, and the great herring fairs at Scania were among the largest commercial events in Northern European medieval life. Merchants came from all over the continent to buy herring at the Scania fairs. German merchants from the Hanseatic League, the commercial alliance of North German cities that controlled much of the Baltic trade, dominated these fairs. They had the capital, the connections, and the fleets to move herring in the quantities required. But sometime in the 14th century, the herring began to change their habits. The reasons for this shift are still debated by marine biologists and historians. Climate change may have been involved. Changes in ocean temperature and salinity affected the breeding patterns of the fish. The cooling that began in the early 14th century, part of the period climatologists now call the Little Ice Age, altered the thermal gradients in the North Sea and the Western Baltic in ways that changed where the herring chose to spawn. Whatever the cause, the herring schools began to appear in greater numbers in the North Sea itself, off the coast of Holland and Zealand, rather than in the Baltic. This was, for the fishing communities of the Dutch coast, a transformation of almost incomprehensible proportions. The herring had come to them, the fish that the entire economy of Northern European food supply depended on were now swimming directly through their waters. All they needed to do was catch them. There was, however, a problem. Fresh herring spoils very quickly. You cannot catch herring in the North Sea and sell them in Cologne or Nuremberg or London before they go bad. The Baltic trade had worked partly because the cold northern climate slowed the spoilage in transit, and the Hanseatic infrastructure for salting and preserving the fish was well established near the source. The Dutch fishermen in their small boats had the fish, but not the technology to make the catch commercially viable at distance. The technology came from an unexpected quarter, a fisherman from the coastal town of Beervliet, whose name has come down in Dutch historical memory as Willem Beukels. Though the details of his biography are largely legendary, is credited with developing or perfecting a technique for gutting and salting herring while still at sea. The process involved removing the gills and part of the gut immediately after the catch, which removed the enzymes that cause the fastest spoilage, and then packing the fish immediately in barrels with salt. The result was a preserved herring that could be kept for months and transported across long distances without becoming inedible. The herring bison, the herring buses, were the specialized ships developed for this new kind of fishery. They were large enough to carry significant quantities of salt and empty barrels outward, and full barrels of preserved herring inward. They had enough crew to handle the nets and the processing simultaneously, and they could stay at sea for extended periods, following the herring schools wherever they went in the North Sea without needing to return to port every few days with a perishable catch. The Dutch herring fleet grew rapidly through the 15th century. By the early 16th century, it was numbering in the hundreds of vessels, crewed by thousands of men and women who were part of the processing industry on shore. The herring trade became the largest single industry in the Dutch economy and the foundation on which the subsequent commercial expansion was built. When later writers of the Golden Age looked back and tried to explain how Amsterdam had become what it was, the herring was the answer they almost always returned to. Amsterdam had been built on herring, they said, and they were not entirely wrong. Amsterdam was not the center of this revolution at first. The initial beneficiaries were the coastal towns of Holland and Zealand, further south and west. But the trade that the herring revolution generated flowed north and east through the waterways of the Low Country, and the dam on the Amstel was positioned to catch it. Fish barrels came through Amsterdam. Salt went the other way. Salt from the Bay of Biscay in France and Portugal, which had to be imported in large quantities because Holland had no natural salt deposits of its own. Barrels of wood from the Baltic went through Amsterdam. Grain, always grain, came in from the east. And Amsterdam began to grow. Not dramatically at first, not in a way that would have surprised anyone watching from outside. Just steadily, generation by generation, family by family, warehouse by warehouse, adding to itself the way that successful places do when the conditions are right. The grain trade was, in some ways, even more important than the herring trade for what Amsterdam would eventually become. The Baltic was the breadbasket of northwestern Europe. The deep, fertile soils of the river valleys that drained into the Baltic produced grain in quantities that no other region of comparable size could match. And much of that grain moved west by sea to feed the populations of the urbanizing Low Countries and the Rhine Valley and beyond. Amsterdam's position on the route between the Baltic and the Atlantic made it the natural hub for this trade. Ships coming from Danzig and Riga and Königsberg, laden with rye and wheat and barley, anchored in the harbour. Their cargo was unloaded, stored in the warehouses that were multiplying along the waterfront, sold to merchants who would arrange its onward movement by river and canal into the interior. Salt and herring and manufactured goods went back the other way. The harbour was, by the mid-15th century, one of the busiest in the North Sea. The early town that grew around the dam on the Amstel was organised in ways that reflected the specific demands of the place and the trade. The physical layout of settlements in the Low Country was not the same as the layout of towns elsewhere in Europe, where a French town might be organised around a castle or a cathedral, where a German town might grow along a ridge or a river crossing defended by walls of stone. The early Dutch town was organised around water. The canals were the streets, the boats were the carts. The warehouses that lined the water's edge were the shops and the counting houses, and the storage facilities that formed the commercial heart of the settlement. The canal in a medieval Dutch town was not a decorative element. It was working infrastructure. Goods came in by water and left by water. The quays along the canal edge were where the transactions happened, where the fish barrels were unloaded from the herring buses, and where the grain sacks were transferred from the Baltic ships to the smaller river boats that would carry them inland. The smell of the medieval Dutch canal town was the smell of salt water and fish and grain, and the particular damp smell of waterlogged wood that comes from pilings and boats and the walls of the buildings that rested on them. The people who worked these quays were specialists in the handling of bulk goods. The weighhouse, where goods were officially measured and taxed, was a civic institution as important as the church in the commercial life of the settlement. The weighhouse in Amsterdam, the Waag, was eventually built as a permanent structure in the late 15th century on what is now the Newmarkt, the New Market. It is still standing, one of the oldest surviving buildings in Amsterdam, a multi-turreted brick structure that served as the weighhouse for more than a century, then as the meeting place of the guilds of surgeons and painters and blacksmiths, and later as a cafe and a museum. Its persistence across 7 centuries of a city that has changed almost everything around it is a reminder of how much continuity can survive beneath the surface of apparent change. The guilds that organised the various trades of medieval and early modern Amsterdam were not simply commercial organisations. They were social institutions that structured the lives of their members from the beginning of their working lives to their deaths. A young man who wanted to work as a baker or a carpenter or a cloth merchant entered the guild as an apprentice, worked for a master for a period of years, and eventually, if he was skilled enough and had saved enough money, became a master himself with the right to employ apprentices of his own. The guild regulated the quality of the work its members produced, the prices they charged, the hours they worked, and the conditions under which they could compete with each other. This system of regulated competition was, from one angle, a constraint on the kind of free market that Amsterdam's later commercial culture would celebrate. From another angle, it was the system that maintained the quality and reputation of Amsterdam's goods in the markets where they were sold. When a buyer in Cologne purchased a piece of Amsterdam woolen cloth, he was buying not just the cloth but the reputation of the Amsterdam Guild that had certified it. The Guild mark was a quality guarantee backed by the collective reputation of all the masters in the guild, and that reputation was worth protecting because it was worth money. The fishing industry was organized differently, less through guild structures and more through the informal networks of the fishing families who owned and crewed the boats. The herring fishery in particular was a family business in the most literal sense. The boats were owned by families, crewed by families, and the knowledge of where the fish could be found and how they could best be caught and preserved was family knowledge passed from father to son and from mother to daughter across generations. When the Dutch herring industry became the foundation of a global commercial empire, it did so by scaling up what had been a family enterprise. But the family unit remained the basic organizational structure of the fishing industry, even as the commercial superstructure above it grew to enormous proportions. The relationship between Amsterdam and its surrounding countryside was not simply that of a market town and its agricultural hinterland. The city needed the countryside for food and for the labor of the people who came from it to work in its industries and its harbor. But the countryside also needed the city as the place where the surplus products of the farms could be sold, where the manufactured goods that farmers required could be purchased, and where the credit that seasonal agricultural production required could be obtained. The Amsterdam merchants who financed the grain ships coming from the Baltic were the same merchants who financed the farms of the North Holland hinterland, and the credit networks that connected these two activities were part of the same web of commercial relationships. The money changers, who sat in the covered galleries of the late medieval dam, before there was a proper exchange building, were the earliest ancestors of the financial institutions that would eventually make Amsterdam the banking capital of the world. Their work was mundane, exchanging the coins of one territory for the coins of another at rates that reflected the known silver content of each, charging a small commission for the service. But the knowledge they accumulated about the relative values of the hundreds of different coins circulating in Northern European trade, and the trust networks they built with the merchants who depended on their reliability, were the practical foundation for the more sophisticated financial instruments that would come later. The bridge that crossed the Amsterdam in the early settlement was a place of meeting as much as a piece of infrastructure. Markets gathered at bridges in the medieval world because bridges were where people had to stop, where they could be counted and taxed, and where the flow of people and goods created the density that commerce requires. The weekly market at the dam was the social and commercial centre of early Amsterdam, the place where the news of the week was exchanged along with the goods, where farmers from the countryside met the merchants of the town, where the harbour workers who had spent the week unloading ships spent their wages on the food and drink and small luxuries that made the rest of the week worthwhile. The 14th century in Northern Europe was, for most people, a time of catastrophic difficulty. The Black Death arrived in the late 1340s and killed between a third and half of the population of the continent in a period of a few years. The social and economic disruption was extraordinary. Labour became scarce because so many workers had died. Social hierarchies that had seemed fixed for centuries cracked under the pressure of massive demographic collapse. Old commercial arrangements were disrupted. Old political certainties dissolved. In Amsterdam, the plague killed people as it killed them everywhere. The town was small enough that the losses would have been devastating at the personal level. Families were wiped out. The church buried more bodies in a few years than it had in the previous generation. The psychological impact of watching neighbours die in the same terrible way over and over for months that stretched into years is something we can only partially understand from the outside. But after the plague, the trade continued. This was the thing about Amsterdam that would define its character for the next several centuries. The trade continued. Whatever happened, wars and plagues and floods and political crises of every description, the trade found a way through Amsterdam. Not because Amsterdam was particularly lucky, though it was sometimes lucky. Not because it was particularly well governed, though it would eventually develop a remarkable form of self-government. But because geography kept delivering goods to the door, and the people who managed those goods were practical enough to keep the system functioning even under terrible pressure. The Hanseatic League, the German commercial alliance that had dominated Baltic trade for generations, found itself in increasing competition with Dutch merchants through the 15th century. The Dutch had cheaper ships because they had developed a new type of vessel, the fluit, which was designed for pure cargo carrying efficiency. The Fluit had a shallow draft that allowed it to navigate the shallow coastal waters of the North Sea and Baltic with ease. It had a small crew relative to its cargo capacity because it was designed to minimize labor costs rather than to carry guns or soldiers. It was a triumph of commercial engineering, a ship optimized for doing one thing very well and doing it at the lowest possible cost. The Fluit allowed Dutch merchants to undercut the prices of their Hanseatic competitors on almost every route in the Baltic. The smaller crew meant lower wage costs. The larger cargo capacity meant more goods per voyage. Over several generations of commercial competition, the Dutch pushed steadily into markets that the Hanse had considered exclusively theirs. By the middle of the 15th century, Amsterdam was a real town. It had a city government, a group of elected burgomasters drawn from the leading merchant families. It had guilds for the various trades. It had multiple churches. It had a harbour that could accommodate the larger cargo ships, the cogs and the hulks and the early versions of the Flyet. It had a population that was, by the tolerant and pragmatic standards it was developing, willing to welcome outsiders who came with useful skills and the intention to work. This last quality would prove to be one of the most important things about Amsterdam for the next 2 centuries. In 1482, a treaty was signed at Arras that reshaped the political map of the Low Country. The Duchy of Burgundy, which had controlled the prosperous towns of the southern Low Countries for several generations, came under the authority of the Habsburg dynasty. The Low Countries became part of an empire that would eventually, through a series of dynastic accidents and marriages, include Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, and much of the New World. The Dukes of Burgundy had been considerable patrons of art and commerce. The southern Low Country cities of Bruges and Ghent, and later Antwerp, had flourished under Burgundian rule, developing the textile industries and the financial networks that made them among the most prosperous places in 15th century Europe. The transition to Habsburg rule was not an immediate catastrophe, but it brought the Low Countries into the orbit of a dynasty with interests and ambitions that extended far beyond the practical concerns of the merchant communities. The Habsburgs were involved in almost perpetual war. They were fighting the Ottomans in the Eastern Mediterranean, a conflict that tied up enormous military resources and generated constant demands for revenue. They were fighting France on multiple fronts. They were suppressing religious dissent in Germany as the Reformation spread through the Protestant North, and they were extracting enormous quantities of wealth from the Americas through their Spanish branch, wealth that was supposed to fund all of this fighting but somehow never quite did. For Amsterdam's merchants, the Habsburg connection was a mixed blessing. It opened markets, it provided military protection intermittently, but it also meant taxes, constant demands for money to fund wars that served Habsburg dynastic ambitions rather than Dutch commercial interests. The religious question was the thing that eventually made this connection untenable. Martin Luther had published his challenge to the Catholic Church in 1517. The ideas spread rapidly through the printing press, which had been invented in the German Rhineland a generation earlier and which was, already by the 1520s, producing a torrent of pamphlets and books and religious arguments that no authority could completely control. The Low Countries, which had a high rate of literacy relative to much of Europe, were particularly receptive to the new ideas. The Calvinist form of Protestantism, austere and demanding, and organized around the idea that the community of believers governed itself without requiring bishops or elaborate hierarchies, found particular resonance in the Dutch commercial towns. It was a religion that matched the culture, practical, collective, focused on discipline and accountability, suspicious of hierarchy that had not been earned through merit. Amsterdam converted to Protestantism in 1578, in an event that Dutch history remembers as the Alteration. This was not a violent upheaval. It was, characteristically for Amsterdam, a practical rearrangement. The Catholic City Council was replaced by a Protestant one. The churches changed hands. The monasteries were dissolved and their buildings repurposed for civic uses. The priests who remained Catholic were asked to leave. Those who converted were allowed to stay. It was managed with the kind of efficient pragmatism that Amsterdam would become famous for. minimizing disruption while achieving the desired end. But the alteration did not happen in isolation. It was part of something much larger and much more violent, a process that would remake the entire Low Country and set Amsterdam on its path to becoming the richest city in the world. The revolt of the Netherlands against Spanish Habsburg rule began in 1566 with iconoclastic riots, Protestant crowds smashing the sculptures and images in Catholic churches across the region. The Duke of Alba arrived with a Spanish army in 1567 to suppress the revolt, and what followed was a period of organized terror. The Council of Troubles, which the Dutch called the Council of Blood, conducted summary trials and executions on a scale designed to frighten the population into submission. The most famous of its victims were the Counts of Egmont and Hoorn, executed in Brussels in 1568 before a large crowd in a piece of theatre designed to demonstrate the consequences of resistance. It did not have the intended effect. The revolt continued, sustained partly by the guerrilla warfare of the Guzen, the sea beggars, Protestant privateers who harassed Spanish shipping and eventually captured the town of Den Briel in 1572, providing the rebellion with a secure base. William of Orange returned to the Netherlands to lead the resistance, and the northern provinces gradually consolidated behind him. The revolt would last, in various forms, for 80 years. Its consequences were felt immediately in the cities of the southern Low Countries. Antwerp was the key. At the height of its power in the mid-16th century, Antwerp was arguably the most important commercial city in Europe. Its position on the Scheldt River gave it access to the Atlantic trade routes and to the deep hinterland of the Rhine and Meuse valleys. Its exchange, the Antwerp Bourse, was the model for every subsequent financial market in the Western world. When Spanish forces sacked Antwerp in 1576, an event so catastrophic that it entered history simply as the Spanish Fury, the soldiers killing thousands of civilians and burning much of the city, the damage was both physical and psychological. The merchants who had built their fortunes in Antwerp began to look for alternatives. When the Spanish reconquered the city in 1585 and blockaded the Scheldt River, that was Antwerp's commercial lifeline, the merchants and financiers and skilled craftsmen of Antwerp began to leave in earnest. They went north. They went to the cities of the Dutch Republic that had successfully declared independence from Spain, and many of them went to Amsterdam. The refugees from Antwerp and the other southern cities brought with them capital and commercial networks and skills in textile manufacturing and diamond cutting and sugar refining and printing and financial instruments that Amsterdam would deploy to extraordinary effect. They were not poor refugees. They were experienced, wealthy, connected people who had spent their careers building one of the most sophisticated commercial cultures in Europe. And Amsterdam, which had always been willing to accommodate outsiders who came with useful things to offer, opened its door. The population of Amsterdam roughly quadrupled between 1570 and 1600. The physical city expanded beyond its original boundaries. New canals were dug, new warehouses were built along the expanding waterfront, the harbour filled with ships from all over the known world. And at the centre of this expanding activity, the merchant oligarchy of Amsterdam was making a decision that would change the course of global history. They were going to build their own spice route. The revolt against Spain was not simply a political or religious event. It was an economic one. The cities that joined the revolt were not primarily motivated by theology, though theology mattered. They were motivated by the calculation that the costs of Spanish rule, the taxes, the interference with trade, the imposition of religious uniformity outweighed the benefits of the protection and the markets that the Habsburgs provided. This calculation was different in different cities and different social groups, which is why the revolt proceeded unevenly, with some cities and regions staying loyal to Spain and others joining the rebellion, and with the same cities changing sides more than once as the military and political situation evolved. Amsterdam was late to the revolt. The city had significant Catholic populations and significant commercial relationships that counselled caution. The merchant oligarchy that governed the city was not by temperament revolutionary. It preferred negotiation to confrontation. It changed sides in 1578, not out of passionate commitment to the Protestant cause, but because the balance of military and commercial advantage had shifted enough to make alignment with the rebel provinces the more prudent course. This pragmatism was, paradoxically, what made Amsterdam so effective as a commercial centre in the decades that followed. The city had not destroyed itself in religious violence the way that some of the southern cities had. It had not expelled its Catholic population wholesale, choosing instead the more characteristically Dutch policy of allowing Catholics to worship privately in hidden churches, the Schuilkerken, the hidden churches that dotted the city and that are among the more remarkable institutions of the Golden Age. A merchant who was Catholic could still do business in Amsterdam. A craftsman who was Catholic could still practice his trade. The religious test was much less rigid in practice than the official reformed character of the city might suggest. The hidden church on the Oederzijds Voorburgwal, known as Ons Lieve Heer op Zolder, Our Lord in the Attic, is the most complete surviving example of these Schuilkerken. It occupies the top floors of a 17th century canal house, its existence concealed from the street by the entirely ordinary residential facade below. Inside, 3 stories of the house have been combined to create a small church with a nave and an altar and a pipe organ, complete with all the furnishings of Catholic worship, tucked into a space that no one who passed the canal house on the street below would have suspected existed. It is still there, preserved as a museum, and it tells you something important about the Amsterdam approach to religious difference. Not elimination, not formal tolerance, but the arrangement of a situation in which the embarrassing difference can be maintained quietly and without visible disruption to the public order. This approach to religious difference was extended to other groups. The Remonstrants and the Mennonites and the English separatists who passed through Amsterdam on their way to the New World all found in the city a degree of practical tolerance that was not available to them in the places they had come from. The Pilgrim Fathers, the English separatists who would eventually sail to Plymouth Rock in 1620, spent 11 years in Leiden, the university town near Amsterdam, before concluding that the Dutch environment, though tolerant, was not the place they wanted to raise their children. They feared that their children were becoming too Dutch, too absorbed into a commercial and pluralistic culture that did not share the intensity of their particular religious vision. The irony that the founding mythology of American religious liberty involves refugees fleeing the tolerance of Amsterdam for the wilderness of New England is one that historians have noted without quite knowing what to do with. The flow of people through Amsterdam in the late 16th and early 17th centuries was enormous by the standards of the time. The city's population growth was driven not just by the Antwerp refugees, but by a continuous stream of migrants from all over Europe and beyond. German craftsmen and merchants came, drawn by the commercial opportunities. English merchants established their own trading houses. French Protestants, the Huguenots, came when Louis XIV revoked the Edict of Nantes in 1685 and expelled the Protestant minority that had been allowed to practice their religion under its provisions. Each group brought something that Amsterdam lacked or needed, and Amsterdam absorbed them with a practical efficiency that made the absorption appear effortless, even when it was not. The city's housing supply strained to keep up with the population growth. The canal ring expansion of the early 17th century was partly a response to this pressure, a planned expansion of the residential and commercial area to accommodate a population that had outgrown the old city walls. But even the canal ring, with its thousands of new building plots, was not sufficient to house all the people who were coming to Amsterdam. The areas behind the canal ring, the Jordaan to the west and the areas to the north and east, were built up in a less planned way, with smaller lots and cheaper construction, housing the workers and craftsmen and small traders who could not afford the canal ring addresses, but who were essential to the commercial life of the city. The Jordaan, whose name may derive from the French word for garden, jardin, though the etymology is disputed, was the artisan quarter of the Golden Age city. Weavers and dyers and hat makers and leather workers lived and worked in its narrow streets. The smells of their industries, the sulphurous smell of the dye works, and the chemical smell of the leather tanning and the fermented smell of the cheese warehouses, mixed with the ordinary domestic smells of cooking and animals, and the ever-present smell of the canals that ran through the neighborhood. The Jordaan was not beautiful in the way the Herengracht was beautiful, but it was alive in a way that made the canal ring, with its ordered facades and its wealthy occupants behind closed doors, seem slightly distant from the actual process of living. The spice trade was, in the 16th century, among the most valuable commercial enterprises in the world. Pepper and nutmeg and cloves and cinnamon and the other spices of the Indonesian archipelago were worth more by weight than almost any other commodity. They were essential for food preservation in an era without refrigeration. They were the basis of medicines and cosmetics and perfumes, and their supply was controlled by the Portuguese, who had established a maritime route around Africa to the East Indies in the late 15th century, and who maintained their monopoly through a combination of naval force and commercial agreements with local rulers. The Portuguese spice that reached Amsterdam came via Lisbon, when Philip II of Spain, who was also Philip I of Portugal, closed Lisbon to Dutch ships in 1594 as part of his ongoing war with the rebellious northern provinces. The Amsterdam merchants were confronted with a simple choice: either find another source of spices or watch a central pillar of their trade collapse. They chose to go get it themselves. The first Dutch expedition to the East Indies left Amsterdam in 1595. 4 ships, 240 men, a voyage of 2 years and 4 months around the Cape of Good Hope and across the Indian Ocean to the island of Java. Disease and violence and the simple difficulty of the voyage killed most of the men. Only 87 returned, and the goods they brought back barely covered costs. But the route was established. The merchants learned what they needed to learn. More expeditions followed almost immediately, dozens of them, funded by competing groups of investors, each trying to reach the Spice Islands before the others. The competition among the Dutch expeditions was itself a problem. When multiple Dutch ships arrived at the same island port at the same time, they drove up the prices they paid for spice and drove down the prices they received for the goods they brought. The solution was the VOC. In 1602, the Amsterdam merchants created the Verenigde Oost-Indische Compagnie, the United East India Company, which history knows as the VOC. Over 6 million guilders were raised in the initial share offering, from hundreds of investors ranging from the great merchant families to small craftsmen who put in a few hundred guilders of savings. The VOC was granted by the States General something that no private company had ever been granted before: a monopoly on Dutch trade east of the Cape of Good Hope and west of the Straits of Magellan, the authority to make war and peace with foreign rulers in its own name, the right to build fortresses and garrisons, the power to appoint governors and judges in the territories it controlled. The VOC was not just a company, it was a company with the powers of a state. It was, in the view of some historians, the world's first multinational corporation. It was also something stranger and darker than that phrase implies: a private institution with sovereign authority over vast territories and millions of people who had never consented to be governed by a group of merchants in Amsterdam. And the trading floor where its shares were bought and sold was in Amsterdam. The Amsterdam Stock Exchange, the Amsterdamse Beurs, had been founded in 1602, the same year as the VOC. It was built in a large courtyard in the center of the city, designed by the architect Hendrik de Keyser, in a style that was functional and dignified without being ostentatious. The exchange was open to the sky, colonnaded on its sides, a space designed for movement and conversation and the constant flow of commercial information that trading required. In the early mornings, when the brokers and merchants began to gather, the exchange had a particular quality of sound. The murmur of many conversations conducted simultaneously, each one focused on some piece of information that might affect the price of a share or a commodity. News arrived from the ships that came into the harbour, news about the state of markets in Batavia and the price of pepper in Malacca, and the political situation in the Persian Gulf. This news moved through the exchange with the speed that information always moves through a room full of people who know that it is worth money. What happened on the floor of the Amsterdam Exchange over the following decades was the invention of modern finance as we recognize it today. The shares of the VOC were the first publicly traded shares in history in the modern sense, available to anyone who could pay, traded freely on the open market, their price moving up and down with the news from the East Indies and the general state of commercial confidence. But the traders at the Amsterdam Exchange quickly discovered that shares themselves were only one kind of thing you could trade. You could also trade options on shares, the right to buy or sell a share at a specified price at a specified future date. You could sell shares you did not yet own on the expectation that the price would fall before you had to deliver them. You could buy shares on credit, using future income as collateral. These instruments, which modern finance knows as futures and options and short selling and margin trading, were all developed or substantially advanced on the floor of the Amsterdam Exchange in the first decades of the 17th century. Joseph de la Vega, a Sephardic Jewish merchant who had grown up in the Amsterdam trading community, wrote a remarkable book in 1688 called Confusion de Confusiones, which described the practices of the Amsterdam Exchange with a vividness and sophistication that remains extraordinary. He described the strategies of the bulls and the bears, the information games, the rumors spread deliberately to move prices, the psychology of crowds making collective decisions with imperfect information. The city also created, in 1609, the Wissel Bank, the Bank of Amsterdam. This was a public bank backed by the city government that accepted deposits of coin and bullion and transferred payments between accounts. The key innovation was that the Wissel Bank maintained a stable currency, the bankguilder, whose value was fixed against a defined quantity of silver and guaranteed by the city of Amsterdam. In an era when the currencies of other cities and states were often debased by rulers who needed money and found it convenient to reduce the silver content of their coins, the bankguilder was reliable. Merchants across Europe trusted it. Accounts denominated in bankguilders became the preferred medium for large international commercial transactions. The combination of the stock exchange and the bank made Amsterdam the financial capital of the Western world. Money came to Amsterdam because Amsterdam was the place where money could be trusted and put to work in more ways than anywhere else. And once money came, more came after it, because money multiplied more effectively where other money was. The 17th century produced, in Amsterdam, a particular kind of intellectual and commercial energy that fed on itself. The density of talent, concentrated in a small city, created opportunities for exchange and collaboration that could not have existed anywhere more spread out. A mathematician working on a problem in one canal house might encounter, at the exchange the next morning, a merchant who had encountered the same problem in a practical form and who had arrived at a partial solution through trial and error. The philosopher who was developing a theory of the nature of God might find, in the bookshop down the street, a recent publication from a Venetian Jesuit or an English Presbyterian that forced him to refine his argument. The printer, who was typesetting a controversial text, might learn from the bookseller next door that the censors were looking for it, giving the author time to revise or withdraw. This density of interaction was what made Amsterdam creative in the 17th century, more even than the wealth that funded it. Wealth without interaction produces collection, not creation. The collectors of the Golden Age did not simply accumulate what others had made. They commissioned, argued, debated, challenged. The militia companies that sat for their group portraits were not passive subjects. They discussed with the painter how they wanted to be shown, and the best painters pushed back, insisting on their own artistic judgment, in ways that sometimes cost them the commission and sometimes produced something neither the painter nor the patron had originally imagined. The relationship between Rembrandt and his patrons is the most famous example of this dynamic, but it was not the only one. Jan Six, one of the great Amsterdam burghers of the mid-17th century, was a patron of Rembrandt, but also a poet and a playwright and a collector of extraordinary discrimination. His friendship with Rembrandt was a genuine intellectual relationship, not simply a commercial one, and the portrait that Rembrandt painted of him in 1654, now in the Six family collection and rarely exhibited publicly, is considered by many art historians to be the greatest single portrait in the history of Dutch painting, precisely because it captures someone of real intellectual complexity rather than simply recording a face. The scientific culture of Amsterdam in the 17th century was as remarkable as the artistic one. Antony van Leeuwenhoek, working in Delft, not Amsterdam, developed the microscope to a level of sophistication that allowed him to observe bacteria, and protozoa and red blood cells for the first time in history. But the intellectual infrastructure that supported his work, the networks of correspondence with the Royal Society in London and with Christian Huygens and with the other natural philosophers of the Dutch Republic, was in large part channeled through Amsterdam, where the printing industry produced the publications that disseminated his findings across Europe. Christian Huygens himself, the Dutch mathematician and astronomer and physicist who invented the pendulum clock and discovered Saturn's rings and worked out the wave theory of light, was a product of the Dutch Republic's remarkable concentration of scientific talent in the 17th century. The pendulum clock was not simply a scientific achievement, it was a commercial one, making possible the accurate timekeeping that navigation and the organization of commercial life required. The connection between scientific innovation and commercial application was, in Amsterdam and the Dutch Republic, more broadly, unusually short. The same culture that funded the Vox voyages was willing to fund the instruments that made those voyages more accurate and safer. The mathematical innovations that the Amsterdam Exchange required, and that the actuarial needs of the insurance industry that grew up around Amsterdam's shipping trades demanded, produced a generation of Dutch mathematicians who worked on problems that had direct commercial applications. The calculation of annuities, the pricing of insurance contracts, the estimation of probabilities, these were not abstract exercises. They were the practical needs of a commercial civilization that had made risk management central to its operations, and the people who worked on them were, in many cases, the same people who were buying and selling on the exchange floor. Simon Stevin, a Flemish mathematician who worked in the Dutch Republic and who was one of the great scientific figures of the late 16th and early 17th centuries, developed decimal notation and pushed for the adoption of the decimal system in commercial calculation. He also wrote on military engineering, on navigation, on civic planning, and on the design of sailing vessels. The range of his interests was not unusual for the time, but the consistency with which they connected scientific knowledge to practical application was characteristic of the Dutch intellectual culture in which he worked. There is a season in Amsterdam when the light does something that painters have been trying to understand for 400 years. It comes in the late afternoon in early autumn, after the summer tourists have thinned and before the grey of November settles in, and it falls on the canal houses and the water between them with a quality that is not quite golden and not quite grey, but something in between, something that makes everything it touches look simultaneously real and slightly dreamlike. 17th century painters noticed this light. They obsessed over it. They built their studios to catch it. They developed techniques for rendering it on wooden panels and stretched canvas that are still, after 4 centuries, not entirely understood by the conservators who study their work. Stand at the edge of the Herengracht today and look at the canal houses, and you are looking at something that was built in a period of perhaps 60 years, roughly 1610 to 1670, which is a remarkable thing when you think about it. A city that had been a small fishing village 2 centuries earlier was constructing, in the space of 2 or 3 generations, one of the most densely concentrated collections of expensive architecture in the world. The canal ring of Amsterdam, the great concentric semicircles of the Herengracht, the Keizersgracht, and the Prinsengracht, was not simply a consequence of commercial success. It was a planned expansion, one of the earliest examples in European history of large-scale urban planning conducted by a civic government rather than by a royal court or a military authority. The city council authorized the project in phases beginning in the early 17th century, designating which areas would be dug for canals, which would become residential streets, which would remain commercial. Plots were sold to private buyers who were required to build within certain specifications of height and setback and building material. The result was a city that had both the advantages of planning and the variety of private expression, a place that felt organized but not rigid, coherent but not monotonous. The canal houses themselves were the product of a particular set of constraints. Land in Amsterdam was expensive, because Amsterdam was built on ground that had to be created and maintained at enormous cost, drained, piled, leveled, and defended. Lots were narrow, because more narrow lots could be taxed separately and because the canal frontage was too valuable to be given to any single owner in large quantities. But they were deep, extending back from the canal front into the interior of the block, and so the Amsterdam house developed its distinctive form. Narrow facade, perhaps 5 or 6 meters wide, many stories tall, with a hoisting beam projecting from the gable peak. The hoisting beam was a practical necessity, because the staircase inside was too steep and too narrow to carry large furniture up and down. Goods for storage in the upper floors, barrels and bales, and the merchandise that the merchant owners traded were lifted from the canal boats below by rope and pulley and swung in through the wide front windows of the upper stories. The gables themselves, the decorative tops of the facades, became objects of competitive display. In the early 17th century, the step gable was dominant, a staircase profile of stone that climbed from the eaves to the peak. Later, the neck gable and the bell gable developed more elaborate and more expensive shapes that announced not just prosperity, but taste and fashion. Walking along the Herengracht today is partly an exercise in reading a century of architectural evolution in the changing shapes of the rooflines. Behind the facades were rooms that contained, in the 17th century, an astonishing density of luxury goods. The great Dutch merchants of the Golden Age were not subtle about their wealth. They decorated their homes with the products of the global trade they managed. Turkish carpets covered the tables because the custom at the time was to put expensive textiles on flat surfaces rather than on floors. Chinese porcelain stood on shelves, blue and white and extraordinarily fine, made in the kilns of Jingdezhen and shipped halfway around the world in the holds of VOC vessels. Silver candlesticks and serving pieces crowded the sideboards. Clocks of remarkable complexity ticked on the mantelpieces, and paintings, extraordinary quantities of paintings, covered every wall in every room. The art market of 17th century Amsterdam was unlike anything that had existed before in European history. Painting had always been an expensive luxury in most of Europe, commissioned by churches and courts and aristocrats who wanted specific subjects rendered in specific ways for specific religious or political purposes. The patron determined the subject. The painter executed the patron's vision. The work was not made to be sold on the open market, because there was no open market. In Amsterdam, the patron was replaced by the market. Paintings were made on speculation, produced by artists who hoped to sell them through dealers or at fairs or directly to individual buyers who came to their studios. The subjects were determined not by the requirements of a single patron, but by the preferences of a broad purchasing public, and that public wanted different things from what the courts and churches of the rest of Europe wanted. They wanted portraits. The Amsterdam merchant who had made his money wanted his face preserved for posterity, and his wealth subtly indicated in his clothing and his bearing and the objects around him. He wanted his wife painted, and his children, and sometimes his whole family together in a scene of domestic contentment. He wanted group portraits of the organizations he belonged to, the civic militia companies, and the guild boards, and the charitable institutions that gave structure to the public life of the city. They wanted landscapes, the flat Dutch countryside, the windmills and the polders, and the wide skies and the rivers and the sea, became subjects for painting in a way that landscape had never quite been before in European art. The world itself, in its ordinary forms, was worthy of attention and representation. The great 17th century landscape painters, Jacob van Ruysdael, Meindert Hobbema, Aelbert Cuyp, found ways to give the flat Dutch terrain a grandeur and a poignancy that makes looking at their work still, 4 centuries later, feel like being somewhere you recognize, even if you have never been there. They wanted domestic scenes. The woman reading a letter by a window, the man weighing gold on a scale, the family gathered at a table, the maid pouring milk from a jug into a bowl on a morning that looks bright and ordinary and utterly specific to this time and this place. The small moments of domestic life, rendered with extraordinary attention to light and material texture, became the subjects of paintings that people bought and hung in their houses and looked at every day. And then there was a painter who did all of these things and more, and did them in a way that no one before or since has quite been able to replicate. Rembrandt Harmenzoon van Rijn was born in Leiden in 1606 and and arrived in Amsterdam in his early 20s, drawn by the wealth of commissions available in the richest city in the world. He was a miller's son from a university town, talented in a way that his contemporaries could see immediately, and that still, 400 years later, is not entirely explicable. He was technically brilliant in a way that few painters, before or since, have matched. His understanding of how paint could be applied, built up in thick layers in some areas and rubbed almost to transparency in others, creating a surface that seemed to have actual depth, was the product of years of intense practice and observation. But technique alone does not explain what his paintings do to the people who stand in front of them. What Rembrandt did with light was not just technically accomplished, it was philosophically serious. His paintings seemed to emerge from darkness the way that human awareness emerges from unconsciousness, shapes gathering from the dim background into sudden, startling presence. The faces in his portraits look back at the viewer from a depth that feels interior rather than simply physical. You have the impression, standing before a Rembrandt, that you are looking at someone who is thinking, not simply someone who is posing, someone whose inner life is present in the image, even though inner life is, by definition, invisible. He arrived in Amsterdam around 1631 and immediately began to receive commissions. He got rich. He spent money extravagantly, buying art and antiquities and curiosities, and filling a large house on the Breestraat with things that interested him. He collected helmets and shields and Japanese armor and exotic textiles and drawings by earlier masters and shells and geological specimens and whatever else caught his attention. He had students who paid him well to study in his workshop. He was, by his 30s, among the most successful painters in Amsterdam. And then the commissions began to dry up. The Night Watch, painted in 1642, is the most famous Dutch painting in the world. It is enormous, nearly 4 meters by 3, and it shows a militia company, Captain Frans Banink Kok and his lieutenant, Willem van Rutenburg, and the members of their company, preparing to march out from the shelter of an arch into the daylight beyond. The composition surges forward with an energy that is almost physical. The light falls from multiple directions at once, or rather, from no single rational direction at all, but from the internal logic of the painting itself. The company that commissioned it reportedly did not like it much. They had expected something more conventional, a formal group portrait showing each member at equal size and equal prominence. What Rembrandt gave them was a painting in which some figures were in full light and others were in shadow, in which the composition moved and breathed and created a narrative rather than simply recording faces. Commissions became rarer as his style grew more experimental and his personal life became more complicated. His wife Saskia died in 1642, the year of the Night Watch. He took a new companion, a woman named Hendrikje Stoffels, who was his devoted partner, but whom he could not formally marry without losing Saskia's inheritance. The Amsterdam Reformed Church summoned Hendrikje before its consistory and accused her of living in sin. She appeared and accepted the reprimand because there was nothing else to do. Rembrandt spent more than he earned. In 1656, he was declared insolvent. His extraordinary collection was sold, item by item, at auction. His house was sold. He moved to a smaller house in what was then the Jewish quarter of Amsterdam and continued to paint until his death in 1669. Alone, his wife long dead, his son recently dead, almost forgotten by the wealthy families who had once competed for his work. He left behind something like 300 paintings and hundreds of drawings and etchings, and in them there is a record of human experience in the 17th century that is irreplaceable. Not just the wealthy faces of the Golden Age, but the old women and the beggars and the Jewish neighbors and the scenes from scripture rendered with a compassion that seems to come from somewhere beyond technique. Rembrandt's great subject was the experience of being human, and he pursued it with a relentlessness that his contemporaries found excessive and that we, looking back, recognize as the defining quality of a genius. He was not alone. Johannes Vermeer in Delft, Jan Steen in Leiden and Haarlem, Jacob van Ruysdael working the landscapes of Holland, Frans Hals in Haarlem, whose group portraits have a spontaneity and a liveliness that seems impossible in paint. The 17th century Dutch Republic produced more significant painters per capita than any other society in human history before or since. The reason was not mysterious. There was money, there were buyers, there was a culture that valued visual experience and was willing to pay for it. The numbers are staggering when you try to picture them. Estimates suggest that between the years 1580 and 1800, Dutch painters produced somewhere between 5 and 10 million paintings. Some of these were masterworks that now hang in the great museums of the world. Most were modest productions, domestic scenes and landscapes and portraits of ordinary people, made for ordinary people to hang in their ordinary houses. The art market was not a luxury market in 17th century Amsterdam, it was a mass market. Everyone bought paintings, from the wealthy merchant with the canal house, to the baker and the carpenter and the domestic servant. This democratization of art collecting was itself a remarkable thing. In most of Europe, art was the possession of the aristocracy and the church. In Amsterdam, a society without a hereditary aristocracy in the traditional sense, art was what comfortable people bought when they wanted to make their homes reflect their values and their prosperity. The role of women in Amsterdam's golden age is one of the dimensions of the city's history that the paintings illuminate and the written record obscures. The paintings show women reading letters, women pouring milk, women weighing pearls, women managing households with an authority and a presence that is not subordinate but central. The written record shows women as legal minors, without independent property rights in most cases, subject to the authority of their fathers and husbands in the commercial and legal sphere. The reality was more complicated than either the paintings or the legal record suggests. Merchant wives in Amsterdam played active roles in managing the businesses of their absent or deceased husbands. Women ran shops and inns and small manufacturing enterprises. The widows of merchants sometimes took over the management of the trading house and maintained it with success, because they had been observing and participating in the business throughout their marriages, even if the legal documentation of the business appeared in their husbands' names. The female painters of the Golden Age, a small but significant group, worked professionally in a context that recognized their skill while restricting their access to certain kinds of training and certain kinds of commission. Judith Leyster, who was a contemporary of Frans Hals and whose work was for centuries attributed to him, is the most significant of these figures. Her paintings have the same energy and directness as Hals's work, and the misattribution of so many of them for so long tells you something about the assumptions that the art market brought to the question of who could have painted something this good. The ordinary women of Amsterdam, the domestic servants and the market traders, and the mothers of the sailors who went to the East Indies and sometimes came back and sometimes did not, are present in the historical record, mainly as statistics and occasionally as the subjects of charitable or legal concern. Their lives are harder to recover than the lives of the wealthy, but they were the lives of the majority, and the city that is remembered for its paintings and its philosophy and its financial innovations was also, for most of the people who lived in it, a city of hard work and uncertain income and the constant management of a difficult environment. The question of what Amsterdam sounded like in the 17th century is one that the historical record allows us to partially reconstruct. The carillons, the sets of tuned bells that hung in the towers of the churches and that played melodies at regular intervals throughout the day, were one of the defining sounds of the Dutch city. Amsterdam's Westerkerk, whose tower is visible from the hiding place where Anne Frank spent 2 years and which she mentioned in her diary as a comforting sound, had a carillon that played every quarter hour and that the people of the neighbourhood came to know as intimately as they knew the weather or the movements of the canal boats. The sound of the carillon was the sound of collective time, the shared measurement of the day by a community that had made the management of time central to its commercial operations. The Westerkerk carillon still plays. The same tower, the same bells, the same melody rhythm, the same reminder that sharing time is one of the deeper things that has always made a city what it is, rather than empty buildings. The way the city smelled and sounded and felt to the body was part of what made it what it was, and it is something that the paintings, for all their sensory richness, cannot quite convey. The harbour of Golden Age Amsterdam was not a quiet place. It was one of the loudest environments in the 17th century world. a constant roar of wooden ships creaking against their moorings, of the shouting of dock workers directing the loading and unloading of cargo, of the creak of the hoisting mechanisms as bales and barrels were swung from ship decks to warehouse floors, of the bells of the harbour churches marking the hours, of the arguments in a dozen languages that were the daily soundtrack of a truly international port. The IJ in front of the city was filled with ships at anchor, waiting their turn to be unloaded. In the busiest periods, the ships were so numerous that a visitor arriving by water from the Zuiderzee could walk across the harbour from ship deck to ship deck without setting foot on water. This is an exaggeration, but not by as much as you might expect. Contemporary accounts describe hundreds of ships in the harbour at once, masts rising from the water like a forest of bare winter trees, the collective activity of loading and unloading, creating a constant motion on the water that could be felt from the city quays. The smells of the harbour were different from the smells of the rest of the city. The fish smell was strongest here, the salt and the slightly fermented smell of the herring barrels, and the sharper smell of the fresh fish brought in by the smaller inshore boats. The tar smell of the shipyards that occupied the eastern part of the harbour complex, the VOC shipyards where the great East Indiamen were built and repaired, was a different note, acrid and industrial, and somehow exciting in the way that industrial processes were exciting in an era when they were still novel. The smell of exotic spices, pepper and nutmeg, and cloves and cinnamon, drifted from the warehouses where the VOC's goods were stored, a smell that would have been immediately associated with wealth and distant places by anyone who encountered it in the 17th century. The social world of the harbour was as various as the goods that passed through it. The sailors who crewed the ships came from everywhere. The VOC's crews were drawn from Germany and Scandinavia and the Baltic coast, as well as from the Netherlands itself, because the Dutch population was not large enough to man the fleets that the company required. The harbour inns and the harbour taverns served men who spoke Norwegian and Swedish and German and Frisian and the various Dutch dialects, alongside the standard Dutch that was emerging as the commercial and administrative language of the Republic. Among these men were former soldiers, and men fleeing legal trouble, and men who had simply found that the sea offered more opportunity than whatever they had left behind. The harbour of Amsterdam was, in this respect, what harbours have always been, a place where the social categories of the land were somewhat loosened, where identity was more fluid, and where the things you could do were more important than the things you had been born to. The VOC and the WIC were largely indifferent to the origins of the men they hired, caring primarily about whether those men could do the work. The rope walks, the long straight sheds where the hemp fibres were twisted into the cables and hawsers that the ships required, occupied the eastern harbour islands that the city had created by driving pilings into the IJ and filling the spaces between them with earth and rubble. The rope walk workers were specialists, their craft requiring the coordination of movements along the full length of the shed, and the rope walks were among the most important industrial establishments in the city, producing the infrastructure of navigation that made the VOC's voyages possible. The VOC maintained its own shipyard on the Eastern Islands, one of the most advanced industrial establishments in the 17th century world, capable of building and fitting out the largest ships that the period's technology allowed. The ships it produced, the East Indiamen, were not the sleek and fast vessels of the herring trade. They were enormous cargo carriers, designed to move the maximum amount of goods across the maximum distance with the minimum of expense, and they were built to a level of durability and reliability that the conditions of the voyage to the East Indies demanded. Amsterdam in the mid-17th century was also, and this mattered enormously for what it was and what it produced, a city of extraordinary intellectual freedom. This was not complete or principled freedom in the modern sense. There were limits. Certain things could not be published openly. Certain opinions could not be expressed in the pulpit without consequences. The Reformed Church had considerable social and moral authority, but by the standards of 17th century Europe, where the Catholic Inquisition was still active in Spain and Italy, where Protestant states burned Anabaptists and Socinians, where the wars of religion had killed hundreds of thousands of people and were still being fought, Amsterdam was something close to a sanctuary. The reasons were not purely ideological. They were, again, practical. Amsterdam was a city that needed people. It needed skilled workers of every description: merchants and printers and diamond cutters and textile workers and sugar refiners and physicians and scholars. The city could not afford to be too particular about the beliefs of the people it attracted, because being too particular meant losing talent to somewhere else. The tolerance of Amsterdam was partly an expression of the city's commercial logic, and partly something that had grown, over generations, into a genuine civic value. Jews who had been expelled from Spain in 1492 and from Portugal in the following decade came to Amsterdam and were allowed to practice their religion openly and maintain their community institutions. The Sephardic Jewish community that established itself in Amsterdam in the early 17th century became one of the most prosperous and intellectually productive Jewish communities in European history. They brought with them the commercial networks that connected the Atlantic world. They became central figures in the sugar trade and the diamond trade and the financial markets. And they built, in their neighborhood on the eastern side of the city, a community of remarkable cultural vitality. They built the Portuguese synagogue, completed in 1675, one of the most beautiful religious buildings in Amsterdam. The interior is extraordinary, a vast space lit by hundreds of candles in brass chandeliers, the sand floor below them, recalling the sand floors of the hidden synagogues in Portugal, where their ancestors had practiced Judaism in secret during the centuries of forced conversion. The synagogue still stands on the water loop line, still lit by candles, still in use. The relationship between Amsterdam and its Jewish community in the 17th century was more complex than the simple story of tolerance sometimes suggests. The tolerance was real, but it was conditional and practical rather than principled in the modern sense. The Jewish community was tolerated because it was useful, because the commercial networks in the capital and the skills that the Sephardic refugees brought from Iberia were genuinely valuable to a city that was building a global commercial empire. The Sephardic Jews who settled in Amsterdam in the early 17th century were not the impoverished refugees that the word refugee sometimes suggests. Many of them were wealthy, experienced merchants who had maintained their commercial networks through the centuries of forced conversion in Portugal and Spain, who had relatives in the trading cities of Hamburg and Venice and Bordeaux and the Ottoman Empire and the Americas, and who brought with them both the capital to invest and the connections to generate returns on that investment. The diamond trade is the most visible example of this dynamic, but it was not the only one. The sugar trade between Brazil and Amsterdam was largely organized and financed by Sephardic Jewish merchants who had connections on both ends of the transaction. The trade in Brazilian dyewood and tobacco and cotton followed similar networks. The financing of the sugar refineries that processed Brazilian sugar in Amsterdam was organized through the credit relationships of the Sephardic community, relationships that extended across national borders and religious categories in ways that the Christian commercial world had more difficulty managing. The Ashkenazi Jewish community, who came to Amsterdam from Poland and Germany during the 17th century, often fleeing the violence of the 30 Years' War and the Cossack massacres of the 1640s in Poland, was less prosperous and less commercially connected than the Sephardim, but also significantly larger. The Ashkenazim settled in the same neighborhoods as the Sephardim, in the area east of the Amstel that became the Jewish Quarter, and the two communities coexisted in Amsterdam with a mixture of mutual support and the occasional tension that comes from sharing a neighborhood with people who share your identity but not your culture. The cultural production of the Amsterdam Jewish community in the 17th century was extraordinary. The printing presses of Amsterdam's Jewish community produced books in Hebrew and in Ladino, the Judeo-Spanish language of the Sephardic diaspora, and in Portuguese and Spanish and Dutch, making Amsterdam the most important center of Jewish publishing in the world. The books produced in Amsterdam's Jewish printing houses were sent to Jewish communities across Europe and the Ottoman Empire and the Americas, maintaining the connections between diaspora communities that were essential to their survival as coherent cultural entities. The intellectual exchanges between the Jewish community and the broader Amsterdam intellectual world were not as systematic as the later myth of Amsterdam's tolerance might suggest, but they were real. Spinoza's philosophy developed partly out of his engagement with the biblical commentary tradition of the Jewish community, and partly out of his encounter with the Cartesian philosophy that was circulating in the Dutch republics, universities, and intellectual salons. The fact that his conclusions were unacceptable to both communities does not diminish the significance of the encounter. The physician Manasseh ben Israel, one of the leading figures of the Amsterdam Sephardic community in the mid-17th century, maintained correspondence and personal relationships with Christian scholars across Europe. His Hope of Israel, published in both Spanish and English in 1650, was a learned argument for the readmission of Jews to England, where they had been formally excluded since their expulsion in 1290. The English philosopher and Hebraist John Selden was one of his correspondents. Rembrandt etched his portrait, one of the very few likenesses of Amsterdam's Jewish community that survived from the period with a name attached. The relationship between Rembrandt and the Jewish quarter, where he spent the last decades of his life, was not simply geographical. It was something more like genuine curiosity, an artist's interest in faces and lives that his contemporaries mostly ignored. The situation of Amsterdam's Jewish community deteriorated in the 18th century as the broader prosperity of the city declined, and as the economic niches that the community had occupied became more contested. The poverty of the Ashkenazi community in particular became a significant civic concern by the mid-18th century, and the community's charitable institutions were strained by the needs of a population that was growing faster than its economic opportunities. The tensions between the community's internal governance and the expectations of the city government that tolerated it became more visible as the prosperity that had made the arrangement workable for both sides became less assured. And from within this community came one of the most extraordinary philosophical minds in the history of Western thought. Baruch Spinoza was born in Amsterdam in 1632, the son of Portuguese Jewish refugees. He was educated in the Jewish community's schools, immersed in the Talmudic tradition and in the broader intellectual currents of his time. The new scientific thinking of Galileo and Descartes, the political philosophy emerging from the experience of the Dutch Republic. What Spinoza developed from these materials was a philosophical system so radical in its implications that even Amsterdam could not fully accommodate it. He was excommunicated from the Jewish community at the age of 23 in 1656, in one of the most comprehensive excommunications recorded in the history of the Amsterdam Jewish community. He believed that God and nature were the same thing, that what humans call God was simply the infinite, self-creating substance of the universe. He believed that the Bible was a human document written by human beings in specific historical circumstances. He believed that freedom of thought was the highest human value, and that political authority was only legitimate when it protected, rather than restricted, the capacity of human beings to think freely. These were views that the 17th century was not ready for. He continued to live in the Dutch Republic, grinding lenses for a living, corresponding with scholars and scientists across Europe, writing philosophy that he knew could not be published in his lifetime without consequences. His ethics and his theological political treatise, which made the argument for freedom of expression and the secular state with a clarity that shocked even sympathetic readers, circulated in manuscript and in unauthorized editions from Dutch printers. He died in 1677 at 44 of a lung disease that his years of lens grinding had likely aggravated. The Amsterdam that had made it possible for him to think these thoughts was the same Amsterdam that could not quite allow him to publish them openly. Both things were true simultaneously, and that simultaneous truth is what the history of Amsterdam is actually about. René Descartes, the French mathematician and philosopher, lived in Amsterdam and other Dutch cities for 20 years in the first half of the 17th century. He chose the Dutch Republic deliberately, writing to a friend that in what other city in the world could he find a place where all the conveniences of life and all the curiosities you could desire were so easily to be found. In Amsterdam, he could write what he wanted to write, without the constant anxiety about ecclesiastical disapproval that would have shadowed him in France. John Locke spent years in the Dutch Republic during the political troubles of Restoration England, refining the political philosophy that would inform the American Declaration of Independence. The question of language in Amsterdam is one that the history of the city makes interesting in ways that are not always noticed. The Dutch language, which is now the unquestioned language of the Netherlands and of Belgian Flanders, was not always so settled in its identity. In the 16th and 17th centuries, the language that was spoken in Amsterdam and the other cities of Holland was one of several closely related Germanic dialects that existed along a continuum, stretching from Flanders in the south to Friesland in the north and the Rhineland in the east. The question of which of these dialects would become the standard language of the emerging Dutch state was not obvious in advance and was settled gradually through the practical demands of commerce and administration rather than through deliberate policy. The Amsterdam dialect, or more precisely the dialect of the merchant class of Amsterdam and the other Holland cities, was the one that effectively prevailed, partly because Amsterdam's commercial dominance meant that its usage was the usage of the people with whom most other Dutch speakers needed to communicate in writing. The translation of the Bible into Dutch, the Statenvertaling, published in 1637, was a major standardizing event, fixing the forms of a written language that would be used across the Dutch-speaking world, and giving a religious authority to the Amsterdam inflected standard that supplemented its commercial authority. The multilingualism of Amsterdam in the Golden Age was a practical reality that the city managed with the same pragmatism it applied to other kinds of diversity. The Portuguese-speaking Sephardic community maintained its own language for internal community use, publishing books and conducting religious services in Portuguese for generations after settling in Amsterdam. The Ashkenazi community used Yiddish. The German and Scandinavian sailors and merchants who passed through the city spoke their own languages among themselves. The Flemish refugees from the southern Low Countries brought their own variants of Dutch that were distinguished from the northern forms by vocabulary and pronunciation. The practical multilingualism of the city extended to the print trade, where books were published in Latin, French, German, English, Spanish, Portuguese, Hebrew, and Yiddish, as well as Dutch. The Amsterdam printing houses that produced these multilingual outputs were serving markets that extended far beyond the Dutch-speaking world, and the ability to produce text in multiple languages and multiple scripts was a significant competitive advantage. The printers who could set type in Hebrew and Latin and Dutch in the same shop were serving the full range of Amsterdam's diverse community, and their technical capabilities were the material expression of the city's tolerance. The relationship between language and identity in Amsterdam was, as it is everywhere, complicated. The shift of the Sephardic community from Portuguese to Dutch as its primary language took several generations and was never complete in the 17th century. The German-speaking merchants maintained German as their language of business, while learning enough Dutch to conduct their affairs in the city. The English community, on the Beginnensteeg, maintained its own church and its own social networks. The diversity was real, but so was the pressure toward a common commercial language, and that pressure operated continuously in the direction of the Amsterdam Dutch that the city's dominant merchant class used. The particular vocabulary of Dutch commerce, the words for financial instruments and shipping practices and commodity types that the Golden Age trade developed, entered the languages of other European commercial cultures as loanwords that revealed the source of the practices they described. The English word stock, in the sense of shares in a company, entered English commercial usage from the Dutch. The English word boom, meaning a sudden expansion of economic activity, has its origin in the Dutch. The language of finance that the world now uses in English carries within it, in its vocabulary and its structure, traces of the Amsterdam original. The printing presses of Amsterdam published editions of radical works that circulated across Europe. The city was the medium through which the new ideas moved, and the movement of ideas, like the movement of herring barrels and grain ships, was something Amsterdam understood how to facilitate. The relationship between Amsterdam and the sea was not simply physical, it was psychological. The city that was built on water, and that depended for its prosperity on the movement of goods across water, maintained a particular awareness of the sea that shaped the way its citizens understood the world and their place in it. The news from the ships was the most important news in Amsterdam. When an East Indiaman arrived in the harbour after a voyage of 18 months or 2 years, the information it carried about the state of markets in Batavia and the condition of the VOC's trading posts and the political situation in the territories the company controlled was immediately significant for the price of the company's shares on the exchange. The men who met the incoming ships and interrogated the captains and the supercargoes before the news became generally known were engaged in a form of information arbitrage that is recognizable as the ancestor of insider trading, and it was practiced with a sophistication that the Amsterdam Exchange's regulations were regularly adjusted to try to address. The mortality of the sea was a constant presence in the city's life. The VOC's voyages were extraordinarily dangerous. Tropical disease killed a significant proportion of every crew. The scurvy that afflicted sailors on the long months between ports, the dysentery and the malaria, and the typhoid fever that swept through the ships anchored in the harbours of Asia, the storms that could sink ships without warning in the waters around the Cape of Good Hope, all of these took a toll that was accepted by the VOC's management as a cost of doing business. But that represented, from the perspective of the sailors' families, a steady stream of widows and orphans in the city's streets and charitable institutions. The charitable institutions of Amsterdam were consequently organised, in part, around the needs of the families of sailors and harbour workers. The hofjes, the almshouses, that still stand in various corners of the old city, were built in many cases with money donated by the wealthy merchant families whose commercial activity depended on the labour of the men and women who lived in them. The plague that struck Amsterdam repeatedly through the 17th century, most severely in 1623 to 1625, and again in 1663 to 1664, killed tens of thousands of people and drove large numbers of the surviving wealthy to their country houses outside the city until the epidemic burned itself out. The 1663 to 1664 plague was particularly severe. Estimates of mortality range from 10 to 20% of the city's population, a toll that emptied entire streets and overwhelmed the city's burial capacity. The plague pits, dug on the outskirts of the city, in those years held thousands of bodies. The economic disruption was severe but, characteristically, temporary. Amsterdam absorbed the loss and rebuilt, the commercial machinery of the city resuming its operations with an efficiency that observers sometimes found unsettling. The management of risk was something that the Amsterdam commercial culture understood in ways that other cultures did not, and the management of the risk of epidemic disease was part of this broader competence. The city maintained a system of quarantine for incoming ships that was among the most sophisticated in Europe, requiring ships from certain ports to anchor in the outer harbour for a period before being allowed into the city. The information network that tracked the state of epidemic disease in the major trading ports of the Mediterranean and the Baltic was part of the same commercial intelligence system that tracked commodity prices and political conditions. The hospitals and the poorhouses and the orphanages that the city maintained were funded partly by the wealthy merchant families whose commercial activity created the wealth that allowed them to be built. The Amsterdam Civic Orphanage, the Burgerweeshuis, which still stands on the Kalverstraat in a building that dates from the late 15th century, was one of the most important charitable institutions in the city, housing hundreds of children at a time and training them in the trades that would allow them to support themselves as adults. The boys trained as craftsmen, the girls as domestic workers, and the institution's regents, the wealthy citizens who oversaw its management, were drawn from the same merchant families who served on the city council and the boards of the VOC and the WIC. The wealth of the Golden Age rested on something that most of the paintings and the philosophy and the architecture of the period preferred not to examine too directly. The VOC maintained its commercial empire through violence and coercion of a systematic and at times horrific kind. The nutmeg monopoly in the Banda Islands, a small group of islands in the eastern Indonesian archipelago that were the only place in the world where nutmeg grew naturally in any commercial quantity, was enforced in the early 17th century through a campaign of violence that reduced the indigenous population from an estimated 15,000 people to perhaps a few hundred. Jan Peter Soon Cohen, the VOC's Governor-General in the East Indies in the 1610s and 1620s, organized the massacre of the Bandanese people with the methodical efficiency of a man who believed that commercial monopoly justified any measure necessary to maintain it. The survivors were enslaved or forced into indentured arrangements on the nutmeg plantations that replaced their traditional society. The plantations were run by Dutch settlers who had been granted parcels of the conquered land and who used enslaved labor to cultivate the nutmeg that made the VOC's shareholders in Amsterdam wealthy. The Dutch West India Company, the WIC, established in 1621 on the model of the VOC to handle trade in the Atlantic, was centrally involved in the slave trade from its earliest years. Dutch ships transported hundreds of thousands of enslaved Africans to the plantations of Brazil and to the Caribbean colonies of Curaçao and Suriname. The sugar and cotton and cacao and other plantation products that came back to Amsterdam were processed by enslaved labor from the moment they were produced at the source. This is not a footnote to the Amsterdam story. It is part of the Amsterdam story, woven through it in ways that cannot be separated without distorting what the story actually is. The canal houses on the Herengracht, the paintings on the walls inside them, the financial instruments developed on the floor of the exchange, the philosophical works produced in the relative freedom of the Dutch Republic, were all supported in part by the profits of this system. The wealth that made Amsterdam the richest city in the world was generated partly by the labor of people who received nothing for it, and who had no voice in the arrangements that governed their lives. The philosophers wrote about freedom. The freedom they wrote about was, in practice, a freedom that was available to a narrow range of people, and its existence was made possible partly by the unfreedom of people in other parts of the world who never appeared in the philosophical texts. This is an uncomfortable thing to hold alongside everything else that is true about Amsterdam's golden age. It is also a necessary thing. History is not obliged to be comfortable. The question of what the golden age meant for the people who did not benefit from it, or who benefited only marginally, is one that the period's own documentation makes it difficult to answer fully. The records that survive are disproportionately the records of the wealthy, because the wealthy were the people who kept records, who wrote letters that were preserved, who appeared in the paintings that have been studied for centuries. The ordinary workers of Amsterdam, the sailors and the dock labourers and the textile workers and the domestic servants, are present in the record mainly as statistics, in the birth and death and marriage registers that the city maintained, and as the subjects of the occasional charitable survey or legal document. What we can piece together from these sources suggests a life that was, for most people, substantially better than the lives available to comparable workers in most other parts of Europe, and substantially worse than the lives enjoyed by the wealthy merchant families whose canal houses are the most visible legacy of the Golden Age. Amsterdam's workers were generally better fed than workers in the inland cities, because the city's position in the food trade meant that grain and fish and dairy products were more reliably available at lower prices than elsewhere. They were generally better housed, in the sense that Amsterdam's building boom of the 17th century produced more housing stock than in most comparable cities. But the housing they could afford was cramped and lacked privacy, and was damp and cold in the North Sea winters. The disease burden was high. The canals that were the life of the city were also its most significant vector for disease, carrying the waste from the houses and the workshops and the animals into the same water that the city's residents sometimes drank and in which children played. The cholera epidemics of the 19th century would eventually make the contamination of canal water undeniable, but the connection between contaminated water and disease was already understood in practice by many 17th century Amsterdammers, even if the germ theory of disease was not available to explain it. The wealthy filtered their canal water or had access to better sources. The poor used it as it was. The life expectancy of a sailor in the VOC's service was dramatically shorter than the life expectancy of a merchant who sent goods on VOC ships from his counting house on the Herengracht. The sailor who survived the voyage to the East Indies and back, a journey that lasted 18 months to 2 years and that killed a significant proportion of every crew, returned to Amsterdam with money that he would typically spend in a few weeks of shore leave and then sign on for another voyage, because there was nothing else available to him that paid as well. The cycle continued until the sailor died at sea or retired to whatever meager provision his savings and the city's charitable institutions could offer. The women who worked in the Amsterdam textile industry, in the silk weaving establishments and the ribbon-making shops and the linen finishing operations, worked for wages that were substantially lower than those of male workers in comparable occupations. The guild system that organized most of the city's skilled trades was structured to benefit male masters and to restrict the participation of women to certain defined roles, typically the lower-paid finishing and preparation stages of production, rather than the more skilled and better compensated primary production stages. And yet, Amsterdam offered something that most of the world outside its boundaries did not. It offered the possibility, however constrained and unequal in practice, of advancement through commercial success. The city had no hereditary aristocracy whose claims would trump those of a successful merchant regardless of how much he earned. The regent and families who governed the city were wealthy families who had achieved their position through commercial success over a generation or two, and who maintained it through continued commercial success and through the social networks that wealth created. A new family could join this group. It was not easy. It required sustained commercial success over a generation, and it required the cultivation of the relationships that membership in the governing class entailed. But it was not impossible, and the possibility was real enough that it shaped the aspirations of the ambitious people who came to Amsterdam from all over Europe and beyond. By the middle of the 17th century, Amsterdam was the richest city per capita that had ever existed anywhere in the world. This is a claim that historians make with some caution, because measuring historical wealth is always approximate and always contested. But the combination of evidence points consistently in the same direction. The size of the harbour, the volume of trade, the quantity of fine goods produced and consumed, the density and quality of the built environment, the sophistication of the financial instruments available on the exchange, the output of the print trade, the accumulation of art and luxury goods in private homes, all of it suggests a concentration of wealth that had no precedent in the historical record. The canal ring held approximately 50,000 people at its peak. The harbour handled, in some years, more ship traffic than the ports of England and France combined. The VOC was, in terms of its total assets and revenues, a larger economic entity than most European states. The Bank Guilder was trusted in commercial centres, from London to Constantinople to the trading ports of Asia. The Amsterdam printing industry produced more books and pamphlets and maps than any other city in Europe. And Amsterdam did this without an aristocracy in the traditional sense, without a king, without vast inherited agricultural estates generating feudal revenue, without conquest of neighbouring territories in the manner of the great land empires. It did it through trade, through organisation, through the consistent application of a kind of practical intelligence to the problem of moving goods and money and information across as much of the world as could be reached. The city was governed by the Regenten, the regents, a group of wealthy families who rotated through the positions of burgomaster and city council over generations. These were not noble families in the European sense. They had no titles, no ancestral estates, no inherited military obligations. They were merchant families whose wealth had accumulated over 2 or 3 generations, and whose social position rested on that wealth and on the networks of commercial and civic relationship that the wealth made possible. When new families rose to wealth, as happened constantly in a city where the commercial opportunity was vast, they gradually entered the charmed circle. When old families declined, as also happened, they gradually lost their positions. It was not a perfectly meritocratic system. The connections of birth mattered, but it was genuinely different from the hereditary aristocracies of most of Europe in ways that made Amsterdam more adaptable and more commercially dynamic than cities governed by men whose positions did not depend on the commercial success of the places they governed. The first serious challenge to Amsterdam's dominance came not from a commercial competitor alone, but from a military one. England and the Dutch Republic had been intermittent allies in the long struggle against Spain, but by the mid-17th century, the relationship had curdled into rivalry. English merchants wanted what Amsterdam had. They wanted control of the carrying trade, the business of moving goods between other countries' ports, which the Dutch had made the foundation of their commercial empire. The English Navigation Acts, passed in 1651 under the Cromwellian Commonwealth, required that goods imported to England be carried in English ships. This was a direct attack on the Dutch carrying trade. It was followed by 3 Anglo-Dutch wars in the second half of the 17th century, wars that were fought primarily at sea, and that tested the naval power of both states against each other in engagements of extraordinary ferocity. The Dutch fought well. In the Second Anglo-Dutch War, the Dutch admiral Michiel de Ruyter led a raid up the Medway River in June 1667 that destroyed much of the English fleet at anchor in its home port, towing away the flagship Royal Charles as a trophy. It remains one of the most humiliating defeats in English naval history. But the wars did not settle the commercial rivalry. They exhausted both sides without producing a decisive result, and a different kind of competition was developing from the broader emerging Atlantic world. France, under Louis XIV, was building a powerful mercantilist state economy specifically designed to displace Dutch commercial dominance. England was developing its own joint stock companies and financial instruments on the Amsterdam model. The innovations that had made Amsterdam singular were being copied. The late 17th century brought a strange moment that altered the relationship between Amsterdam and the English permanently. The Dutch stadtholder, William of Orange, was invited by a faction of English Protestant nobles to intervene against the Catholic-leaning King James II. William landed in England with a Dutch army in November 1688, and James II fled to France. William and his wife Mary were offered the English throne by Parliament in exchange for accepting a Bill of Rights that limited royal authority. William III became King of England while remaining stadtholder of the Dutch Republic. In practice, this union transferred a great deal of Dutch capital and commercial expertise to England. Dutch financiers accompanied William to London. The Bank of England, founded in 1694, was modelled explicitly on the Bank of Amsterdam and organised largely by Dutch and Huguenot financiers. The Amsterdam model of public finance was transplanted to London, and London began to develop the institutional infrastructure that would eventually make it the successor to Amsterdam as the centre of global commercial finance. Amsterdam did not collapse. It remained wealthy and important well into the 18th century. But the trajectory had shifted. The decline of Amsterdam as a commercial centre was not experienced as a decline by the people who lived through it, at least not in the early stages. The city became wealthier in absolute terms through much of the 18th century, even as its relative position weakened. The canal houses were maintained and occasionally improved. New cultural institutions were founded. The public life of the city continued to function. The sense of diminishment came only gradually, as the centre of commercial gravity moved to London, and the margins by which Amsterdam had once outcompeted its rivals narrowed and then reversed. The Dutch Republic itself underwent a transformation in the late 18th century that was driven partly by the internal contradictions of the Regentan oligarchy and partly by the broader currents of Enlightenment political thought. The Patriots, a political movement that drew inspiration from the American and later the French revolutions, challenged the dominance of the Orange Party and the merchant oligarchy in the 1780s. Their demands for a more democratic constitution and for the curtailment of the powers that had become concentrated in the hands of a small group of wealthy families were not unreasonable, and they had significant support in Amsterdam and other major cities. The Patriot movement failed in 1787 when the Prussian army, invited by William V of Orange, invaded the Republic and restored the Orange stadtholderate. Many patriots went into exile in France, where they waited for the opportunity that the French Revolution would eventually provide. When French armies crossed the Rhine in 1795 and the Dutch Republic collapsed without serious military resistance, the patriots returned with the French and established the Batavian Republic, a sister republic to the French one, with a constitution that was more democratic than anything the Dutch had experienced before. The Batavian Republic and the French occupation that followed it brought changes that were both liberating and destructive. Jews were emancipated, receiving for the first time full civic rights as citizens rather than being restricted to the limited autonomy they had enjoyed as a separate community. The old guild system was abolished. The ancient privileges that had protected certain trades and certain families from competition were swept away. In their place came the rhetoric of universal rights and the practice of French imperial control. The continental blockade that Napoleon imposed, cutting British trade off from the continent, was economically devastating for Amsterdam, in a way that was almost as severe as the wars that had preceded it. The Amsterdam harbour, which had been the busiest in the world for much of the 17th century, went quiet. Ships that had once moved in and out daily now sat idle at their moorings or simply did not come. The warehouses that had been full of the goods of the world stood empty. The financial institutions that had survived the losses of the late 17th and 18th centuries found that there was nothing left to finance. When Napoleon incorporated the Netherlands into the French Empire in 1810, abolishing even the nominal independence of the Kingdom of Holland that he had established under his brother Louis, Amsterdam was a city in serious distress. The population had fallen. Buildings that had been worth fortunes were now worth fractions of their former values. The great merchant families were managing their assets carefully, trying to preserve what they had through a period that offered no good options for commercial activity. The restoration of Dutch independence, after Napoleon's defeat in 1813 and the establishment of the Kingdom of the Netherlands under William I of Orange, brought relief, but not immediate recovery. The commercial networks and the financial relationships that had made Amsterdam the centre of the world's trade had been disrupted for a generation. They did not snap back into their old forms when the French left. The rebuilding was slow and incomplete, and it occurred in a world that was already substantially different from the world that Amsterdam had dominated. The Industrial Revolution that was transforming England and Belgium in the first decades of the 19th century came to the Netherlands later and less completely. The country lacked the coal and iron that industrial production required, and its geographical position as a transit and service economy meant that it was more naturally suited to the emerging role of broker and financier than to direct manufacturing. This was not a disaster. It was an adaptation. Amsterdam in the 19th century became the financial centre of a smaller and less ambitious enterprise than the global commercial empire of the 17th century. But it remained a functioning and reasonably prosperous city. The 18th century in Amsterdam was a long, slow autumn. The city was still rich. The canal houses still stood. The exchange still functioned. The VOC still sent ships to the East Indies, though its commercial position was eroding. The cultural life of the city was still active, though it had lost the particular creative intensity of the Golden Age. What had changed was the direction of money. Amsterdam was no longer the place where new fortunes were being made in the most adventurous and innovative ways. The great merchant families had become wealthy enough that they no longer needed to take the commercial risks that had made their ancestors rich. They lived comfortably on the returns from their capital, investing conservatively, avoiding the disruptions that came with ambitious new ventures. This was not irrational, but it was, cumulatively, a sign that Amsterdam was becoming a city that managed inherited wealth rather than created new wealth. The VOC was slowly going bankrupt. It had been mismanaged for decades, its debts mounting as the cost of maintaining its military and administrative infrastructure in Asia grew while its trading profits declined. The Here and the 17th continued to pay dividends they could not afford, borrowing to maintain the appearance of health. In 1799, the VOC was formally dissolved, and its debts and assets were assumed by the state. The Napoleonic Wars at the beginning of the 19th century did considerable damage. The French occupation, which lasted from 1795 to 1813, brought the continental blockade that cut Amsterdam off from British trade. The harbour nearly died during the blockade years. The city's population fell. Buildings were sold at fractions of their earlier value. When the French finally left and the Netherlands emerged as an independent kingdom under the House of Orange, Amsterdam had to rebuild its commercial life from a significantly reduced base. The 19th century brought the Industrial Revolution, and with it, a new form of urban life and commercial organisation that Amsterdam was relatively slow to adopt. The Netherlands industrialized later than England and Belgium and Germany. The country had no coal and limited iron. Amsterdam found its place in the industrial economy as what it had always been, a city of trade and finance and services. The harbour was modernized. The North Sea Canal, built in 1876, gave ocean-going ships a direct route from the sea to the harbour, bypassing the shallow and shifting sandbanks that had always made the approach to Amsterdam difficult. The railways connected the city to the industrial hinterland of Europe. The Great Amsterdam Centraal Station, built on an artificial island in the IJ in the 1880s, in a style that mixed Gothic and Renaissance elements, is still the point at which the traveller arrives in Amsterdam from the rest of the world. Its back turns to the water that gave the city its character, an irony that contemporaries noted and that has never been entirely resolved. The population grew rapidly. Workers came from the countryside and from other parts of the Netherlands and from further afield. The city expanded beyond the canal ring for the first time in 2 centuries. New neighbourhoods were built on the polders to the south and east and west, row houses for the working class, apartment buildings for the middle class. The character of the city was changing. The merchant oligarchy of the Golden Age had been replaced by a more complex and contested social structure. The labour movement arrived in Amsterdam in the 1890s and grew rapidly through the early 20th century. The socialist parties won seats in the city council. The housing question became central to Amsterdam's politics, in a way it had never quite been when the city was dominated by wealthy merchants with no particular interest in the living conditions of the poor. The social housing movement that developed in Amsterdam in the late 19th and early 20th centuries produced some of the most remarkable architecture of the period. The Amsterdam School, a style of brick building with ornate decorative elements that drew on Art Nouveau and on the distinctive traditions of Dutch brick construction going back to the Golden Age. The buildings of the Amsterdam School, concentrated in the neighbourhoods built in the 1920s to the south of the Old City, are considered among the masterworks of early 20th century European architecture. Then came the 20th century, which asked Amsterdam a question that no amount of commercial genius or philosophical sophistication could entirely prepare it for. The question was, what do you do when the worst thing imaginable happens? Amsterdam, before 1940, was a city that had been at peace since the Napoleonic Wars. It had its social tensions and its political struggles and its economic difficulties, the depression of the 1930s having hit the Netherlands hard, but it had not experienced violence on the scale of what the century was producing in Germany and Russia and Spain. It was a city that believed, with reasonable evidence, in the basic stability of the civilization it had been part of building over several centuries. The German occupation began in May 1940 and lasted until the spring of 1945. 5 years that remade the city's understanding of itself in ways that have not been fully resolved in the 80 years since. The German occupation brought to Amsterdam the full weight of the racial laws that the Nazi state had been developing since 1933. Jews were required to register. They were excluded from civic life. They were required to wear the yellow star. And then, beginning in 1942, they were rounded up and deported to the concentration camps in the east. The deportations were organized through the Dutch state apparatus, the city police, the railway system, the administrative records that had been built up over generations to manage the affairs of a modern city. Of roughly 80,000 Jews in Amsterdam at the time of the occupation, fewer than 20,000 survived. The community that had been in the city since the 17th century, that had built the Portuguese synagogue and produced Spinoza and contributed so much to the city's commercial and intellectual life, was almost entirely destroyed. The streets of the old Jewish quarter were emptied. The buildings remained. The people did not. Anne Frank hid with her family and 4 other people in a concealed apartment behind a bookcase in a canal house on the Prinsengracht from July 1942 to August 1944. The house belonged to the father's business premises, and the hiding place was arranged by non-Jewish friends and colleagues who risked their lives to provide food and support. For 25 months, 8 people lived in a small space with covered windows, moving as quietly as possible during the day when the warehouse workers below them were present, listening to the radio for news from the war, trying to maintain the routines of ordinary life in conditions that made ordinary life impossible. Anne Frank kept a diary throughout the hiding period. She was 13 when the hiding began, and 15 when the family was discovered and arrested, betrayed to the German authorities by an informant who was never definitively identified. She died in Bergen-Belsen in February 1945, 2 months before the liberation of the Netherlands. Her father, Otto Frank, the only member of the family to survive, returned to Amsterdam after the war and found the diary among the papers that had been saved. When it was finally published in 1947, it was immediately recognized as something important. It has since been translated into 70 languages and read by hundreds of millions of people. The house on the Prinsengracht is still there. The bookcase that concealed the entrance to the hiding place is still there. The rooms where 8 people lived for 2 years are preserved. The pencil marks on the doorframe where Anne and her sister Margot measured their heights. The photographs she had cut from magazines and stuck to the wall of her bedroom. People stand in those rooms and are confronted with a question that does not have a satisfying answer. How did this happen in this city? In the city of Spinoza, the city that had made itself a refuge for the persecuted of Europe, the city whose founding tradition was tolerance and whose commercial culture had always been the enemy of the kind of rigid categories that Nazi ideology represented. The winter of 1944 to 1945, which the Dutch call the Hunger Winter, killed approximately 22,000 people in the occupied Western Netherlands from starvation and cold. The German occupation authorities blocked food transport into the western provinces as retaliation for a railway strike. People ate tulip bulbs. People burned their furniture for warmth. The city that had once been the richest in the world was, in those months, a place of lethal scarcity. Liberation came in May 1945, and it was genuine liberation, received with a relief and a joy so overwhelming that the photographs of the jubilant streets still carry the emotional weight of it. The Amsterdam that rebuilt itself after the war was a city trying to hold several things together at once. The old city, the canal ring, and the remarkable physical inheritance of the Golden Age. A new social contract that rejected the inequalities and exclusions of the old order. The memory of what had happened to the Jewish community and the desire to be part of a new, more integrated Europe that would make such catastrophes impossible while maintaining the particular character and independence that Amsterdam had always valued. The post-war Netherlands developed one of the most comprehensive welfare states in Europe. Social housing was built on a massive scale in the new neighborhoods beyond the old city. Healthcare and education were made universal. The labor movement, which had been central to Amsterdam's political life since the 1890s, took an active role in shaping the post-war settlement. The bicycle became, through the decades, the defining feature of Amsterdam's street life. The city has more bicycles than people. The sound of the city is the sound of bicycle wheels on brick streets, the creak of the large carrier bikes that parents use to transport children, the ring of the bells that alert pedestrians who have strayed into the cycling paths. The canal ring, which was briefly threatened by proposals to fill in the canals and build roads in the 1950s, was preserved partly because the bicycle made it unnecessary to prioritize the car in the way that other European cities were doing. The Provo movement of the 1960s, a group of anarchist provocateurs who staged happenings in public space and challenged authority with a wit and irreverence that recalled the pamphleteers of the Golden Age, made Amsterdam briefly the center of European counterculture. Their white bicycle plan proposed that the city government provide free white bicycles for public use, a proposal that was rejected at the time and that would take another 50 years to be vindicated in spirit. The canal houses were gradually recognized as the extraordinary architectural heritage they represented. Gentrification followed, slowly at first, and then with increasing speed, as Amsterdam's reputation as one of the most livable and beautiful cities in Europe attracted international attention and international money. The story of Amsterdam after the Second World War is, in some ways, the story of a city learning to be honest about what it was and what it had done. The post-war decades in the Netherlands were marked by an intense desire for normalcy after the catastrophe of the occupation, and normalcy meant, for much of the Dutch population, not dwelling on the aspects of the war years that were most painful to remember. The collaboration, the degree to which ordinary Dutch people and Dutch institutions had participated in the machinery of deportation, was not something that the post-war Dutch public was eager to examine. The memory that was cultivated instead was one of resistance, of the strikes and the underground networks and the hiding places and the acts of individual courage that had marked the occupation years. This memory was not false. The resistance was real. The people who hid Jewish families and forged identity documents and published underground newspapers were real people who took real risks and sometimes paid with their lives. But the resistance was a minority experience in a country whose majority had navigated the occupation with various degrees of compliance and collaboration, and the post-war celebration of the resistance as the defining experience of the occupation years required the systematic underplaying of the collaboration. The work of honest historical reckoning began slowly in the Netherlands, accelerating through the 1960s and 1970s, as a new generation that had not experienced the occupation began to ask questions that the generation that had experienced it had preferred not to answer. The publications of historians like Lode Jong, whose massive multi-volume history of the Netherlands in the Second World War was published over several decades and became a monument of Dutch historical writing, began to fill in the picture that the post-war memory had left incomplete. The specific question of Dutch Jewish history in the war years was particularly fraught. The death rate of Dutch Jews in the Holocaust was among the highest in Western Europe, a fact that was painful to confront in a country that had prided itself on its tradition of tolerance. The reasons for the high death rate were complex and still debated by historians, but they included the efficiency of the Dutch bureaucratic system, which had maintained detailed population registers that made the identification of Jews straightforward, and the fact that the Dutch geography, a flat country with well-maintained roads and reliable communications, made escape and concealment difficult. The Anne Frank House, which opened as a museum in 1960, was the first major institutional attempt to make the experience of the occupation concrete and present for the post-war Dutch public and for international visitors. The decision to preserve the hiding place and make it accessible to visitors was itself a significant act of cultural policy, an acknowledgement that the experience of the Jewish community during the occupation was part of the national story in a way that the post-war memory had tended to marginalize. The museum has been expanded and refined over the decades since its opening, and it now attracts close to 1 million visitors per year, making it one of the most visited historical sites in Europe. The experience of visiting it has changed as the surrounding neighborhood has changed, as the Canal House has been embedded in the tourist infrastructure of the Canal Ring. But the core experience of walking through the rooms where 8 people spent 2 years in hiding remains, for most visitors, something that resists the usual distancing mechanisms of tourism. The smallness of the space, the closeness of the walls, the marks on the doorframe where growth was measured, these things make the abstract historical event specific and present in a way that few historical sites manage. The parallel reckoning with the colonial history of the Dutch Golden Age has been slower and remains more contested. The VOC and the WIC and the slave trade and the plantation system of the Dutch colonial empire are further removed in time from the present than the Second World War, and the direct descendants of the people who suffered under these systems are in many cases not present in the Netherlands in the same numbers as the survivors and descendants of the Dutch Jewish community. The reckoning that has occurred has been driven partly by academic historians, partly by the descendants of the enslaved people who were brought to the Dutch Caribbean colonies, and partly by the broader global conversation about the legacy of slavery and colonialism that has intensified in the early 21st century. The Netherlands formally acknowledged its role in the transatlantic slave trade in a governmental statement issued in 2023, an act of recognition that had been debated for decades and that satisfied some and was judged insufficient by others. The city of Amsterdam has renamed streets that bore the names of figures associated with the slave trade. The Rijksmuseum has reorganized some of its collections to contextualize the colonial origins of certain objects. These are genuine steps in a process that is not finished and may never be finished in the sense of reaching a point of resolution. History is not the kind of thing that can be finished with. Today, Amsterdam is one of the most visited cities in Europe. The Canal Ring is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, recognized in 2010 as an exceptional example of urban planning and architecture of the early modern period. The Rijksmuseum holds the greatest collection of Dutch Golden Age painting in the world. The Night Watch hangs in its own purpose-built gallery, enormous and immediate, surrounded each day by hundreds of visitors who stand before it and experience the thing that Rembrandt spent his life trying to give them, the sense of looking at something that is looking back. The city is beautiful. This is, at this point in the story, a simple fact. The canal houses stand as they have stood for 4 centuries, their gables reflected in the dark water below them, their interiors lit in the evenings in ways that make you want to know who lives there and what their life is like. The light comes off the canals at certain angles, with a quality that you recognize from the paintings, that particular northern Atlantic light that is both bright and soft at the same time, that makes shadows interesting rather than harsh. There is a quality to certain evenings in Amsterdam that is different from any other city. It has to do with the particular combination of water and light and architecture that the city presents, and it is worth trying to describe, even at the risk of failing. In the late afternoon of a clear autumn day, when the low northern sun is still above the horizon but declining, the light reaches the canal houses at an angle that does not occur at other latitudes and other seasons. It catches the brick of the facades in a way that brings out the variations in the material, the darker bricks and the lighter ones, the places where the repointing is newer and the places where the original mortar survives. It reflects off the glass of the windows at an angle that makes them glow without making them opaque, so that you can see both the reflection and, sometimes, the interior behind. The reflections in the canal are, at this time of day, at their most complex. The house facades are reflected in the water below, but the reflections are not simple mirror images. The movement of the water distorts them into fragments that are individually recognizable and collectively abstract. The reflection of a canal house in the Herengracht in the late afternoon autumn light is simultaneously the record of a specific building and a kind of painting, a moving, fragmentary, water-mediated version of the building that has been made by no human hand, but that could not have been produced without one. The painters of the Golden Age understood this. They painted not just the canal houses, but their reflections. They understood that the water was part of the city in a way that went beyond the purely functional, that the reflections were not merely incidental, but were part of what Amsterdam was. The Dutch tradition of painting water, of rendering the surface of canals and rivers and the harbour with a precision that the Northern European light made possible, is one of the most distinctive achievements of the Golden Age, and it is not separable from the physical reality of the city in which those painters worked. Walking through Amsterdam in the early evening, when the shops are closing and the commuters are cycling home and the tourist crowds have thinned, you encounter the city at a scale that is surprisingly intimate. The canal houses are not large by the standards of great European architecture. They are domestic in scale, built for families and their servants and their businesses, rather than for the display of royal power. Walking along the Keizersgracht and looking up at the facades, you are looking at something that was built for people like yourself. Wealthy people, certainly, but people who had children and needed to store their goods and wanted their faces painted and their books printed and their churches maintained. This is the experience that makes the Canal Ring UNESCO worthy, not the quality of any single building, but the coherence and the scale of the whole. The urban fabric that was created between 1610 and 1670 in the Canal Ring is genuinely unlike anything else in Europe, a planned environment that has maintained its integrity across 4 centuries of continuous use and constant change. The individual buildings have been modified, repaired, adapted, and occasionally replaced. The people who live in them have changed beyond recognition, but the structure, the relationship of canal to street to facade to gable to sky, has persisted with remarkable fidelity to what the original planners and builders created. Amsterdam built itself around its water, not because water was beautiful, but because water was necessary. And in the process of making the necessary thing work, it found that the necessary thing was beautiful. This is perhaps the oldest human story, older even than the story of Amsterdam, the story of how the things we make to survive become the things we love. Amsterdam has been working, slowly and imperfectly, to account for the full complexity of its history in its public culture. The museums have changed the way they present the colonial history of the Dutch Golden Age. Streets named for figures implicated in the slave trade are being renamed. The conversation is ongoing, contested, sometimes acrimonious, the way conversations about difficult history always are. That conversation is itself, in a strange way, a continuation of the tradition of public debate and collective self-examination that has always been one of Amsterdam's distinguishing characteristics. There is a question that the history of Amsterdam raises that does not have an easy answer. The city's golden age was built on a combination of things: geography and commercial intelligence, and institutional innovation, and the energy of refugees who brought their capital and skills from less tolerant places. The accumulated knowledge of a society that had been fighting the sea for centuries. The freedom of thought that attracted philosophers and artists and printers who could not work elsewhere, and the systematic exploitation of people in other parts of the world who had no say in the arrangements that enriched Amsterdam, and whose labour and land and lives were consumed by the VOC and the WIC and the plantation system they sustained. How do you hold all of that together in a single understanding of what Amsterdam was and is? There is no formula. History is not a problem that can be solved. It is a condition that has to be inhabited, and inhabiting it honestly means staying with the discomfort of its contradictions rather than resolving them too quickly in either direction. Amsterdam was genuinely exceptional in the degree of freedom it offered, by the standards of its own time, to people whom other places would have persecuted or excluded. It was also genuinely implicated in some of the worst practices of the colonial era. Both things are true. They were true simultaneously in the 17th century, when Spinoza was writing about freedom in the same city that was profiting from the Banda Islands massacre. And they remain true now, when we look back and try to account for what Amsterdam was and what it means. There is something else that the Amsterdam story preserves. Something that does not fit neatly into either the story of triumph or the story of failure. It is the story of what ordinary people can do when they organize themselves around practical necessity over many generations. The people who built the first dikes on the Amstel in the 12th century were not responding to a grand vision. They were responding to water. The water was there, and it was going to destroy what they had built if they did not organize together to manage it. The dike required collective action. The agreement of neighboring landowners to contribute labor and materials and to maintain the structure in perpetuity. The earliest form of Dutch political organization, the Water Board, was created for this purpose. And it was a democratic institution long before democratic institutions were fashionable, not because the people who created it had read classical philosophy, but because the alternative was drowning. This practical democracy, rooted in shared physical necessity, shaped the culture that would produce the merchant oligarchy of the Golden Age, the financial innovations of the exchange, the willingness to accommodate outsiders, the restless commercial intelligence that found ways to reach the Spice Islands and sell herring in the Baltic and create the first publicly traded stock. Amsterdam at its peak was not the product of visionary leadership in the usual sense. It had no great founding figure, no philosopher king, no military genius whose campaigns had built its power. It was the product of a culture that had learned, over centuries of living on ground that wanted to be water, that survival required cooperation, that excessive individual ambition was dangerous to the collective, and that the practical problem in front of you was usually more important than the grand principle behind it. There is something in that which is admirable. There is also something in it which explains the silences, the things that the practical merchants of Amsterdam preferred not to examine too closely about how their wealth was generated. Pragmatism is a virtue and a limit simultaneously. It gives you the canal ring and the Bank of Amsterdam and the stock exchange. It also gives you the ability to manage the business of the Banda Islands without asking the questions that would make the business impossible. The Amstel still flows, as it has flowed for 10,000 years since the ice retreated and the delta began to form. The dam that gave the city its name is long since buried under the dam square, the broad plaza at the center of the old city where the royal palace stands. Built in the 17th century as the city hall of the richest municipality in the world, and later appropriated by the House of Orange as a royal residence. Beneath the square, if you go down to the foundations, you find the past preserved in the way that Amsterdam has always preserved things, not through grand monuments or deliberate memorialization, but through the persistence of the material. Old timber pilings, driven into the peat 7 centuries ago and still holding, fragments of medieval pottery. The traces of streets that followed paths that were already old when the first written records of the city begin. The city sits on something like 11 million wooden pilings, columns of timber driven through the soft ground to reach the harder sand layer below. Without them, the buildings would sink. The canal houses, on the Herengracht, the Rijksmuseum, the Central Station, all stand because something invisible below refuses to let them fall. There is, in this image, something that feels true about the city as a whole. The visible Amsterdam, the canal houses, and the paintings, and the financial markets, and the philosophical tradition, and the beautiful light on the water in the autumn afternoons, rests on something you cannot see. On the constant, unspectacular work of holding the ground up against the weight that presses on it from above. On the accumulated labor of generations of people who drove pilings and built dikes and managed waterboards and maintained the infrastructure that makes life in this improbable place possible. Somewhere around 1150, someone drove the first stake into the peat at the mouth of the Amstel. They did not know they were beginning a city. They were just trying to keep the water out. That is how it always starts. Not with vision or ambition or the desire to build something great. With the simple, urgent need to stay above the flood. And from that need, somehow, extraordinarily, all the rest of it followed. The water is still there. It is always still there. The sea to the west, held back by the dunes and the dikes and the great storm surge barriers that the Dutch have built in the 20th century, engineering works of a scale and sophistication that would have amazed even the hydraulic engineers of the Golden Age. The IJ, behind the Central Station, where the ferries cross every few minutes between the old city and the new neighborhoods on the north bank. The canals that carry the tourist boats and the houseboats and the kayaks and the reflections of the canal houses and the light of those particular afternoons when Amsterdam glows with something that painters have been trying to understand. For 400 years, the city built on water has learned to live with water the way that very few places in human history have managed. Not by defeating it, not by paving it over and pretending it does not exist, but by working with it, negotiating with it, making it useful, making it beautiful, making it the defining characteristic of the place rather than its enemy. In the early mornings, before the tourists arrive and before the city traffic builds, you can stand on one of the humpbacked bridges over the Herengracht and hear only the water moving and the birds and the creak of the houseboats at their moorings. The light is pale and clean. The gables of the canal houses stand in their rows, each one slightly different from its neighbours, the product of 2 centuries of private expression within a collective framework. The reflections in the canal below are dark and still and very slightly trembling, the way that reflections always do in moving water. The city that should not exist does exist and is extraordinary, and the story of how it came to be is not entirely finished. Climate change is making the sea more threatening again. The North Sea storms that hammered the Dutch coast in the 20th century are going to hammer it more severely in the 21st. The hydraulic infrastructure that the Netherlands has built over 1,000 years will need to be rebuilt and extended and made more capable than it has ever been. The Dutch are already working on this, because the Dutch have always been working on this. It is what they do. The Water Board, the oldest democratic institution in the country, is still meeting. The engineers are still calculating. The practical intelligence that drove the first dike builders in the 12th century, that organised the herring fleet in the 15th, that created the stock exchange in the 17th, is still applied to the same fundamental problem. How do you stay above the flood? Amsterdam, from a flooded swamp to the richest city in the world. From a dam on a small river to an empire that reached the furthest islands of the East Indies. From a fishing village where people built mounds to keep the water away from their feet, to a city where the water is the thing that makes it what it is, dark and still between the old stone banks, holding the reflections of 8 centuries of extraordinary life. The city should not exist. It exists anyway, and in the quiet of the evening, when the last tourist boats have gone from the canals, and the light is failing over the Herengracht, and the water is still and dark, and holding the reflections of the houses that have stood there since the 17th century, the city feels less like something built by human ambition, and more like something that grew, slowly, generation by generation, out of the water itself, patient and strange and completely at home in a place that should never have been able to hold it. But there is more to this story than the outline allows. The details are where the truth lives, and the truth of Amsterdam is that its centuries were not smooth arcs but jagged, contested, specific things that happened to specific people in specific rooms and on specific ships and in the hold of specific ideas. Take the tulip. In the winter of 1636 and into the spring of 1637, the Dutch Republic experienced something that economic historians have been arguing about ever since. The prices of tulip bulbs, particularly the rare, striped and feathered varieties that were caused by a mosaic virus that infected the plant, rose to extraordinary heights. A single bulb of a prized variety called Semper Augustus reportedly sold for as much as 10,000 guilders, enough to buy a comfortable canal house on the Herengracht. Contracts for bulbs, not yet dug, were bought and sold in taverns by people who had never owned a flower garden in their lives. The tulip had arrived in the Netherlands from the Ottoman Empire in the second half of the 16th century, carried by a Flemish botanist named Carolus Clusius, who had encountered the flower at the court of the Habsburg Emperor in Vienna. It was new and it was strange, and it was immediately beautiful, in a way that the Northern European botanical tradition had not previously produced. The striped and broken varieties, which appeared to be different flowers altogether from the solid-coloured originals, and were in fact diseased plants that would eventually weaken and die from their infection, commanded the highest prices from collectors who had no way of knowing what caused them. The mania, if that is what it was, collapsed in February of 1637 as suddenly as it had built up. Prices fell, contracts became worthless, and buyers who had committed to purchase bulbs at peak prices found themselves unable to pay and unwilling to honour agreements that now represented catastrophic losses. The courts became clogged with contract disputes. Fortunes were ruined. Amsterdam discussed the episode in pamphlets and sermons for years afterward. What economic historians have debated since is whether the tulip episode was truly a speculative bubble of the kind that was possible because of Amsterdam's sophisticated financial instruments, or whether it was a more limited phenomenon involving primarily a small group of professional traders whose contracts were widely understood to be unenforceable. The answer matters because if the tulip mania was a true market bubble, it was the first major speculative bubble in the history of modern finance, a preview of the South Sea bubble and the Mississippi Company, and every subsequent financial crisis that has followed the same pattern of confident excess followed by sudden collapse. What is not in doubt is that the tulip episode tells you something important about the culture of Amsterdam in the Golden Age. This was a society in which almost anything could become a commodity, in which the market's capacity to price things extended from grain and herring and spice to the rare and the beautiful and the purely speculative. It was a culture in which ordinary people participated in markets, not just the wealthy merchants on the exchange floor, but tavern-goers and craftsmen and small traders who saw in the rising prices of bulbs the same opportunity that they saw in the shares of the VOC. The willingness to speculate, to take risk on uncertain future prices, was not just a financial behavior in Amsterdam, it was a cultural one. It was part of what made Amsterdam what it was, the same quality that sent ships to the East Indies before anyone knew what they would find there, the same quality that funded expeditions to find the Northwest Passage and to map the coast of Australia, the same quality that built the canal ring before anyone could be entirely certain that the ground it sat on would hold. Risk was the Amsterdam condition, managed and organized and institutionalized in ways that made it less dangerous than it might otherwise have been, but never entirely eliminated. The city had learned to live with risk, the way it had learned to live with water, by building systems that contained it without pretending it was not there. The diamond trade was another story within the Amsterdam story that deserves more attention than it usually receives. The diamond cutters of Amsterdam were among the most skilled craftsmen in the world from the 17th century onward. The craft had been brought to Amsterdam by Sephardic Jewish refugees from Antwerp, where the art of faceting diamonds had been developed in the 16th century. In Amsterdam, the craft concentrated in the Jewish community, partly because the close-knit social networks of the community were well suited to an industry that required trust and specialized knowledge, and partly because the commercial networks that the Sephardic community maintained across the Atlantic world gave them access to the rough stones that came from Brazil and later from India. The faceting of diamonds is not simply a technical process. It is an art that requires the cutter to understand the crystal structure of the stone, to see in the rough material the finished gem that is inside it, and to remove the material that obscures the gem without damaging the stone or wasting more of it than necessary. The skill was transmitted through apprenticeship, master to student, generation to generation, in the workshops that occupied the back streets of the Jewish quarter. Amsterdam became, in the 17th and 18th centuries, the diamond capital of the world. The city's position in the Atlantic trade, its access to the Brazilian sources that had begun to dominate diamond supply in the early 18th century, its community of skilled cutters, and its sophisticated financial infrastructure for dealing in valuable commodities all contributed to this position. When a diamond was found anywhere in the world, the odds were that it would eventually make its way to Amsterdam to be cut and polished and sold. The labor movement that developed among Amsterdam's diamond workers in the late 19th century was among the most significant in Dutch history. The Algemene Nederlands Diamantbewerkersbond, the General Dutch Diamond Workers Union, founded in 1894, was a model of democratic trade union organization that influenced the development of the broader Dutch labor movement. Its first leader, Henri Polak, was a socialist intellectual from an Amsterdam Jewish family who combined passionate advocacy for workers' rights with a commitment to cultural education that made the Diamond Workers Union one of the most culturally active labor organizations in Europe. The diamond industry's golden age in Amsterdam ended in the 20th century, partly as a result of the Holocaust, which destroyed much of the Jewish community that had been its backbone, and partly as a result of competition from cutting centers in India and elsewhere that could offer lower labor costs. But the craft survived, in smaller form, and the city still has a small community of working diamond cutters who continue a tradition that has been part of Amsterdam's economic and cultural life for more than 400 years. The book trade is another element of Amsterdam's story that opened the world. Amsterdam's printers and booksellers were, in the 17th century, among the most important people in European intellectual life. Not because of who they were personally, though some of them were remarkable individuals, but because of what they did. They took the ideas that were being developed by Descartes and Spinoza and John Locke and Galileo and the other thinkers of the age, and they printed them and sold them and distributed them across a continent that was hungry for new ways of understanding the world. This was not always easy. The authors they published were sometimes controversial to the point of dangerous. Spinoza's books were officially banned in many places. Works arguing for religious tolerance or the rights of citizens against monarchs were the kind of thing that in other countries would bring the printer to the attention of the Inquisition or the royal censor. In Amsterdam, the risk was considerably lower. The Dutch state had neither the inclination nor the effective mechanism to police the contents of books in the way that the Spanish or French monarchies attempted to. The booksellers of the Kalverstraat and the Klovenisbergwal maintained correspondence networks with scholars and intellectuals across Europe. They knew what was being written, what was being censored elsewhere, what ideas were circulating in manuscript form among the learned communities of Paris and London and Leiden. When a manuscript arrived in Amsterdam that could not be published elsewhere, They assessed its commercial potential, and, if the assessment was favorable, they printed it. The result was that Amsterdam's printing industry became the safety valve for European intellectual life. Ideas that were suppressed elsewhere could circulate from Amsterdam. Books that were illegal in France were printed there and smuggled across the border in shipments of legitimate goods. The pamphlets and periodicals that kept the Dutch reading public informed about events across Europe were produced by an industry that was, by the standards of the time, remarkably free. This freedom had limits, as all freedoms in Amsterdam did. Blasphemy could still bring a printer before the authorities. Libel of powerful individuals was still risky. Certain kinds of political argument were safer than others. But the general atmosphere of the Amsterdam print trade was one in which a wide range of ideas could be expressed and sold. And this made Amsterdam, for the 2 centuries of its commercial dominance, the place where the most interesting things were being said and printed and distributed. Hugo Grotius, the Dutch jurist and philosopher, wrote in the early 17th century the foundational texts of international law. His Mare Liberum, the Free Sea, published in 1609, argued that the oceans were international territory and that no single nation could claim exclusive rights over maritime routes. This was an argument that served Dutch commercial interests directly, since the Portuguese and Spanish had been claiming exactly those exclusive rights over the sea routes to the East and West Indies. But it was also a genuine contribution to the legal philosophy of the emerging international order, an attempt to establish principles that would apply regardless of which nation was powerful enough to enforce its claims. The idea of freedom of the seas was not simply a convenient doctrine for Amsterdam's merchants. It was part of a broader intellectual project shared by Grotius and Spinoza and Locke and others who found in the Dutch Republic the freedom to think it through, of establishing principles of natural right and international law that could constrain states and create something like a stable international order. Amsterdam, the city of trade, was also the city from which these arguments emerged, because the trade required the arguments. You cannot build a global commercial empire without also developing the legal and philosophical frameworks that justify and regulate it. Johan de Witt was the Grand Pensionary of the province of Holland from 1653 to 1672, the most powerful political figure in the Dutch Republic during the height of its golden age. He was not a king and not a military leader. He was a bureaucrat of extraordinary intelligence and administrative skill, a man who ran the commercial republic through a combination of financial expertise and political management that kept the Regentan oligarchy functioning and kept the republic from being overwhelmed by the monarchical powers that surrounded it. De Witt believed in what he called the true freedom, the idea that the Dutch Republic could govern itself without a stadtholder, without the House of Orange as a quasi-monarchical executive authority, and that the commercial prosperity of the Republic was better served by the collective governance of the merchant oligarchies than by the hereditary authority of a single family. This was not simply a political theory, it was a practical assessment of where Dutch interests lay. The wars that the Orange stadtholders had pursued had been expensive and often counterproductive. The commercial peace that de Witt maintained was more profitable, but the true freedom had enemies. The Orange Party, which drew support from the Reformed Church and from the military establishment and from the ordinary people who associated the House of Orange with national identity and Protestant solidarity, never accepted the Regentan oligarchy's claim to represent the whole Republic. And when Louis XIV invaded the Republic in 1672, overrunning much of the country in weeks, the political crisis that followed destroyed de Witt. The Rampjaar, the disaster year, as 1672 is known in Dutch history, was a moment that tested everything Amsterdam believed about itself. The most successful commercial state in the world was nearly overwhelmed militarily by a land power that simply marched around the sea power that the Dutch had relied on for their defense. The French army stood at the gates of Amsterdam. The dikes were opened to flood the surrounding countryside and slow the advance. It worked, barely. De Witt and his brother Cornelis were accused of treason. They were murdered by an Orange mob in The Hague in August 1672, a lynching of such ferocity that the bodies were mutilated and body parts reportedly sold as souvenirs. William III, of Orange, was restored as stadtholder. The true freedom was over. The cartographic tradition of Amsterdam in the Golden Age was another dimension of the city's intellectual and commercial life that deserves attention in its own right. Maps were not simply useful tools in the 17th century. They were instruments of power, of commerce, of scientific inquiry, and of aesthetic pleasure. The great cartographic firms of Amsterdam, the Blauw family and the Hondius Jansonius partnership and their successors, produced some of the most beautiful and most technically sophisticated maps and atlases ever made. Objects that combine the best geographical knowledge available with the artistic traditions of Dutch engraving and the commercial acumen of Amsterdam's print trade. Joan Blauw's Atlas Major, published in 11 volumes in 1662, was the largest, most expensive book ever produced in the 17th century. It contained over 600 maps of every part of the known world, accompanied by descriptive text in Latin and Dutch and French and Spanish and German, and it was sold for prices that only the wealthiest libraries and most prosperous private collectors could afford. It was a monument to the ambition of Amsterdam's commercial culture and to the quality of its intellectual and artistic production. A book that said as clearly as any building or painting that Amsterdam was the center of the world and that the world knew it. The knowledge that went into the Amsterdam atlases was gathered from the VOC's captains and navigators, who were required to submit logs and charts to the company after every voyage, and from the network of correspondents and agents that Amsterdam's commercial connections gave the cartographic firms access to. The cartographers were not simply organizing knowledge that others had gathered. They were actively engaged in the production of geographical knowledge, sending questionnaires to missionaries and merchants and colonial administrators, corresponding with mathematicians and astronomers about the calculations required for accurate map projection, and debating with each other about the best methods for representing a curved surface on a flat sheet of paper. The maps themselves recorded the expansion of the European world's geographical knowledge in real time, updating from edition to edition as new information arrived. The coastlines of continents that had been tentative suggestions in the atlases of the late 16th century became precise outlines in the atlases of the mid-17th, as the VOC's voyages added information. The interior of continents remained blank, or filled with imagined geography, long after the coastlines were accurately known, because the information about interiors came more slowly and less reliably. The decorative elements of the Amsterdam maps, the elaborate cartouches in the corners, and the figures representing the peoples and the economies of the mapped regions were arguments about the nature and the organization of the world, about who belonged where, and what the relations between different peoples and different places were. The way that the inhabitants of Africa and Asia and the Americas were depicted in the decorative elements of the Amsterdam atlases reflected the commercial and cultural assumptions of the people who made the maps, assumptions that are sometimes comfortable and sometimes profoundly uncomfortable to examine from the perspective of the present. The sea charts that the VOC's navigators used were a different kind of cartographic product, practical rather than decorative, updated constantly as new soundings were taken and new hazards identified, and kept secret by the company because the information they contained was commercially valuable. The route to the East Indies was not something the VOC wanted its competitors to have access to, and the charts that showed the safest passages through the Indonesian archipelago were among the company's most jealously guarded intellectual property. The episode is remembered in Amsterdam not simply as a political crisis, but as a warning about the fragility of commercial success, about the limits of a state organized around trade rather than military power, about the vulnerability of political systems that depend on prosperity to maintain their legitimacy. When prosperity failed, even temporarily, the Amsterdam model came under pressure that it was not fully equipped to resist. These are not comfortable lessons. They are lessons that Amsterdam drew from its own history and that its subsequent conduct showed it had only partially absorbed. The Portuguese synagogue deserves more than a passing mention in this story. When it was consecrated in 1675, it was the largest synagogue in the world. The Esnoga, as the Sephardic community calls it, was built in a style that owed something to Dutch civic architecture and something to the memories of the synagogues of the Iberian Peninsula that the community had been forced to leave. But that was ultimately its own thing, a product of the specific circumstances of the Amsterdam Sephardic community and of the specific vision of its builders. The community that built it had been through something almost inconceivable. Their parents and grandparents had lived in Spain and Portugal as conversos, forced converts to Christianity, practicing Judaism in secret, maintaining a cultural and religious identity that was illegal and that exposed them to the Inquisition if they were discovered. The journey to Amsterdam, to a city where they could openly be what they were, had been a journey to a kind of freedom that the generation that made it understood with an intensity that later generations, born in freedom, could only imagine. The synagogue was their statement about what they had survived and what they had built. The sand floor, which is still maintained today, recalls the sandy floors of the hidden synagogues in Portugal, a deliberate preservation of the memory of secrecy and survival. The 500 candles in the brass chandeliers, which light the synagogue on Shabbat because it has never been electrified, create an atmosphere that is otherworldly in the literal sense, genuinely different from the world outside, a space that has preserved something from the 17th century into the present. The community that worshipped there produced, in the generations following its founding, not just Spinoza, but a range of scholars and scientists and physicians and poets who contributed to the intellectual life of Amsterdam and of the broader Atlantic world. The Sephardic tradition of learning, maintained through the centuries of forced conversion and exile, found in Amsterdam the conditions in which it could flower openly. The Holocaust very nearly destroyed this community, as it destroyed so much else. Most of the Sephardic Jews of Amsterdam were deported and killed. The synagogue was not desecrated by the German occupiers, perhaps because they intended to use it for their own purposes after the Jews were gone. It survived, and when the war ended, the small community of survivors returned to it. Today, the Portuguese synagogue is a museum, as much as a functioning place of worship, the community too small to fill it on most occasions. But on the high holy days, when the candles are lit and the service proceeds by the light that the builders intended, the space does something that history rarely manages to do so completely. It connects the present to a specific past, a specific group of people who built this thing in a specific city, in a specific century, and who would be astonished and perhaps moved to find it still standing and still in use. The story of Amsterdam in the second half of the 20th century is, in some ways, the story of a city learning to be comfortable with being remembered. The Canal Ring, which had been a living commercial and residential neighborhood in the 17th century, and which had declined through the 18th and 19th centuries into something more varied and less uniformly prosperous, became in the post-war decades a heritage landscape. The recognition that the canal houses were something irreplaceable came gradually, driven partly by the growing global interest in historic preservation, and partly by the specific academic and civic attention that Dutch architects and historians devoted to understanding what made Amsterdam's built environment distinctive. The restoration of the canal houses was not simply a physical process, though it involved enormous amounts of physical work, stabilizing foundations and replacing rotted timber and repointing brickwork and restoring the gables that had been simplified or damaged over the centuries. It was also a cultural and economic process. The houses that had been subdivided and cheaply maintained became desirable again. The middle and upper middle class families who moved into them brought money that funded further restoration. The neighborhood became, over several decades, increasingly expensive and increasingly monocultural in a way that the Golden Age Canal Ring had never been. The tension between the Canal Ring as heritage landscape and the Canal Ring as living neighborhood has never been fully resolved. The tourists who come in their millions to walk the bridges and take canal boat tours are both the consequence of the heritage value and a threat to the residential character that is part of what makes the place feel genuinely inhabited, rather than merely preserved. Amsterdam has responded to this tension with the pragmatic creativity that is its oldest tradition. The city has invested in the neighborhoods outside the heritage core, building cultural institutions and public spaces, and housing that give residents reasons to live throughout the city rather than concentrated in the most picturesque parts. It has restricted the conversion of residential properties to short-term tourist accommodation. It has tried to distribute the economic benefits of tourism more broadly, beyond the handful of streets and attractions that absorb the majority of visitor attention. Whether these measures will be enough is genuinely uncertain. The pressures on cities like Amsterdam, pressures of rising property values and tourism, and changing demographics and climate change, are larger than any individual city's policies can fully contain. Amsterdam will continue to change, as it has always changed. The question is whether the change will preserve what is most essential about the place, and that question is always more complicated than it appears. The question of what happens to a city after its great age is over is one that Amsterdam has been living with for 3 centuries. The Venice comparison is one that Amsterdammers sometimes resist and sometimes embrace, and it is worth examining carefully. Venice and Amsterdam are the 2 great commercial city republics of early modern Europe, the 2 cities that most completely made commerce their organizing principle and that built their physical environments most fully in the service of that principle. Both cities built on water in ways that transformed the water from an obstacle into an advantage. Both cities developed financial institutions that were ahead of their time and that were eventually superseded by the institutions of larger and more powerful states. Both cities declined from a position of global commercial dominance to a position of cultural and touristic significance. But the comparison obscures as much as it reveals. Venice's decline was more dramatic and more complete. The Ottoman conquest of the eastern Mediterranean routes that had been Venice's commercial foundation was a shock that Amsterdam's more gradual displacement from its position by London never quite replicated. Venice became a tourist destination in the 18th century and has remained one ever since. Its population declining as its visitor numbers grew, its economy increasingly dependent on serving the curiosity of people from elsewhere. Amsterdam has not followed this path, partly because its economy remained more diverse, partly because its role as a financial and commercial centre, though diminished from its 17th century peak, never entirely disappeared, and partly because the Netherlands as a whole remained a functioning and reasonably prosperous state in ways that the Republic of Venice, which had no such larger entity to fold into, did not. The analogy to London is more useful in some ways than the analogy to Venice. Amsterdam's relationship to London is the relationship of the inventor to the adopter, the relationship of the original to the copy that eventually surpasses the original. London took the financial innovations of Amsterdam, the joint stock company and the central bank and the bond market and the insurance market, and scaled them to the resources of a larger and more militarily powerful state. The Bank of England outlasted the Bank of Amsterdam. The London Stock Exchange eventually surpassed the Amsterdam Exchange. The City of London became what the Canal Ring had been, the place where the world's money was managed and multiplied. This displacement happened over a long time and was never absolute. Amsterdam remained an important financial centre through much of the 18th century, and Dutch capital remained significant in the international economy long after Dutch commercial and military power had declined. The Barings brothers, who financed the Louisiana Purchase on behalf of the United States government in 1803, were English by the time of the transaction, but had their roots in a Dutch-German merchant family. The networks that Amsterdam had built in the 17th century were still generating returns in the 19th, even as the city that had originated them had receded from the centre of the action. The contemporary Amsterdam is, in some ways, the beneficiary of this history in a form that could not have been predicted. The city that was the financial capital of the world in the 17th century is now the financial capital of the Netherlands, a significant but not globally dominant position, and also one of the most culturally rich and physically beautiful cities in Europe. The canal ring that was built to house the merchants of the Golden Age now houses a mixture of residents and tourists and businesses, and its maintenance is one of the major challenges and one of the major achievements of contemporary Amsterdam's civic management. The technology companies that have established European headquarters in Amsterdam in recent decades are drawn partly by the quality of life that the city offers, partly by the practical advantages of its location and its transport connections, and partly, perhaps, by something harder to define: a sense that Amsterdam is the kind of place where the kind of people they want to hire want to live. This soft power, the attractiveness of a city that has been a place of intellectual freedom and commercial sophistication and physical beauty for 8 centuries, is a form of the legacy of the Golden Age that is genuinely valuable, even if it is impossible to put a number on. The Amsterdam of the 21st century is not the Amsterdam of the 17th century, and it would be sentimental to pretend otherwise. But it is a city that has preserved more of what made it distinctive in the 17th century than almost any other European city has preserved of its historical character, and that preservation is itself an achievement worth acknowledging. The Canal Ring is not a museum. It is a living environment in which people work and live and raise children and conduct the ordinary business of daily life. The fact that it happens to be one of the most remarkable urban environments created in the history of human civilization is, from the inside, just the context in which ordinary life happens. There is a final image that seems right for this story. At the edge of the Oosterdok, the eastern harbour that was the heart of Amsterdam's maritime activity in the Golden Age, there is a replica of a VOC ship, the Amsterdam, which ran aground on its maiden voyage in 1749 and sank in the English Channel. The original wreck has been studied by archaeologists because it preserves, in remarkable condition, the contents of a 17th century trading vessel. The personal belongings of the crew, the ship's stores, the tools and equipment of the voyage, all kept by the cold water of the Channel in a kind of accidental museum. The replica sits at the dock of the Maritime Museum, and you can go aboard and see the reconstructed life of the ship. The cramped quarters where the sailors lived, the hold where the cargo was stowed, the navigation instruments, and the rigging, and the smell of old wood and salt. It is an attempt to bring back something that is gone, to make concrete and present the thing that is now only a record and a wreck. Amsterdam has always been trying to do this, to recover what has been lost and make it available to the present. The Anne Frank house recovers one specific hiding place in one specific year of one specific war. The Portuguese synagogue recovers the specific cultural tradition of one specific community of refugees. The Rijksmuseum recovers the specific visual culture of one specific century of extraordinary artistic production. None of these recoveries is complete. None of them gives you the thing itself. The 17th century Amsterdam that smelled of canal water and salt herring and wood smoke, where the sound of the exchange was the daily background of commercial life, where Rembrandt's studio was just another building on a street of buildings, where the ships in the harbour were going to places that most people in the city would never see. That Amsterdam is gone, as all particular versions of particular cities are gone. What remains is the structure, the canal ring in its improbable beauty, the light on the water in the afternoons, the pilings below the city that hold it up, the water that surrounds it, patient and present, the thing that made Amsterdam necessary in the first place, the challenge that the people of the Amstel Delta accepted when they drove the first stake into the peat somewhere around 1150 and decided that this improbable place would be where they lived. They built a city that should not exist. They made it the richest city in the world. They produced paintings and philosophy and financial innovations that shaped the modern world. They also did terrible things in other parts of the world in the name of the commerce that made them prosperous. They survived the worst century in European history. They rebuilt. They kept the water out. The water is still there. The city is still there. The question of what Amsterdam means, what it tells us about human capability and human failure, and the strange, persistent, inexplicable impulse to build something that endures, is still an open question. There is one more dimension of this city that the history books sometimes underweight, and it matters to understand Amsterdam fully. Amsterdam was, at various moments in its history, a city of the poor as much as a city of the wealthy. The canal houses and the paintings and the philosophy do not represent the experience of the majority of the people who lived here. The majority were sailors who came back from the East Indies if they were fortunate, and did not if they were not. They were warehouse workers and dock labourers and textile weavers, working in industries the merchant families owned. They were domestic servants in the canal houses. They were the women who processed the herring on the quays, their hands permanently reddened by the salt. The working poor of Golden Age Amsterdam lived in conditions that would be recognisable in their outlines to anyone familiar with the working poor of any pre-industrial city. Overcrowded housing in the alleys behind the canal houses. Diets that were adequate in quantity but monotonous in quality, bread and herring and turnips, the occasional luxury of butter or cheese. Work that was seasonal and insecure, dependent on the weather and the state of trade and the health of the ship's captain, and a dozen other factors beyond the workers' control. Children who worked from an early age because the family needed the income. Old age that came quickly and was often spent in the care of the city's charitable institutions if one had no family to depend on. Amsterdam's merchant oligarchy was not indifferent to the condition of the poor. Indifference was not exactly the right word. They built charitable institutions of considerable sophistication, the hofjes, the almshouses for elderly women, some of which still stand and still function in the old city. They funded orphanages. They established the Rasfuss, an institution for the correction of vagabonds and petty criminals through forced labour, which was an early and somewhat grim experiment in institutional rehabilitation. These were genuine expressions of civic responsibility, however paternalistic in their structure. But the charitable institutions also served a function beyond charity. A city in which the poor were too miserable became unstable. Workers, who had nothing to lose, had no reason to maintain the social order that benefited their employers. The occasional riots over bread prices and working conditions that punctuated Amsterdam's history were reminders that the prosperity of the few depended on the relative stability of the many. The merchant oligarchy understood this at some level, even if they did not articulate it in those terms. The conditions of the working poor improved very slowly through the 17th and 18th centuries, and then improved more dramatically in the 19th and 20th as the labour movement organised and the welfare state developed. The Amsterdam of the 21st century, for all its inequalities and housing pressures, provides a quality of life to its ordinary residents that the sailors and dock workers of the Golden Age would have found unimaginable. The trajectory of the city's social history is, in that sense, genuinely positive. A slow and contested but real improvement in the conditions of life for most people. This matters to say because the history of a city is not only the history of its spectacular moments and its representative figures, it is the history of all the ordinary people who woke up every morning and went to work and came home and ate their bread and herring and went to sleep and did it again the next day. They are harder to see in the historical record because they left fewer records, but they were the city's substance, the human material without which the canal ring and the exchange and the philosophical tradition would have been impossible. Let the closing words of this history be about water and time. The North Sea is rising. It has been rising since the last ice age, since the glaciers retreated and the meltwater found its way to the ocean. A long, slow process that climate change has accelerated. The Dutch have been watching this for 1,000 years. They have been responding to it for almost as long. The Delta Works, the great system of storm surge barriers and floodgates constructed in the second half of the 20th century, following the catastrophic North Sea flood of 1953, which killed nearly 2,000 people in the Netherlands, are among the most impressive engineering achievements in human history. The Maaslandkering near Rotterdam, a pair of floating barriers each as large as the Eiffel Tower, can be swung closed within hours when a surge threatens. The Oosterscheldekering, 9 kilometers long, protects the Zeeland estuary. The system represents a commitment of resources and engineering intelligence that has few precedents, and it is not enough. The projections of climate scientists suggest that the sea will rise faster in the coming century than the Delta Works were designed to accommodate. The Netherlands is already planning the next generation of adaptations, raising dikes, redesigning coastal areas, rethinking the relationship between land and water in ways that move beyond simple defense towards something more like the accommodation that the earliest Dutch communities practiced, a willingness to let some areas flood that were never supposed to flood in the long term. Amsterdam sits at the center of this challenge. The city that was built by holding back the water is going to have to decide, in the coming decades, how to maintain that stance as the water becomes more insistent. The decisions will be expensive and complicated and politically contested, because the things that are worth doing in the face of long-term environmental change always are. But the Dutch have been making these decisions, in one form or another, for 1,000 years. They have the institutions and the engineering tradition and the civic culture for it. They have the water boards that have been making collective decisions about water management since the 12th century. They have the memory of what happens when the dikes fail. Amsterdam will not be easily surrendered to the sea. The city that should not exist has existed for 8 centuries, and the practical intelligence that built it has not gone anywhere. There is one detail about the physical city that ought to be named before this history closes. The canal ring, for all its beauty, is not static. It has always been in motion, imperceptibly but continuously. The wooden pilings that support the buildings absorb and release water with the seasons. The brick of the canal house facades expands and contracts with temperature. The canal walls, built of brown brick from the kilns of the Rhine Delta, have been repointed and repaired, and occasionally rebuilt over 4 centuries. The surface that looks ancient is in many places relatively recent, maintained by the constant labour of specialists who understand the material and the forces acting on it. A living city is never simply preserved. It is perpetually recreated. Amsterdam recreates itself in this way every day, out of sight, in the hands of the craftsmen and the engineers and the administrators who keep the physical infrastructure functioning. They are the modern version of the dike builders of the 12th century, doing the unglamorous, essential work that makes everything else possible. The sound of the city in the early morning, before the tourists arrive and before the offices open, is one of the things that visitors who know Amsterdam well remember most specifically. It is never silence. A city built on water is never silent. There is always the sound of water moving, the small rhythmic sound of the canals responding to the wind and the passing of the ferry and the distant traffic. There are the birds, the gulls from the harbour, the jackdaws in the old house gables, the occasional heron standing absolutely still at the water's edge, waiting for fish it somehow knows will come. There is the creak of the houseboat moored at the canal, the small domestic sounds carrying easily over the still morning water. Amsterdam speaks quietly in those hours, in the language of water and wood and bird. And if you have the patience to listen, it tells you something about what it is and what it has always been. A place where human life and water and time have arrived at something that resembles, in certain lights, understanding. It may always be. Sleep well. The water keeps careful watch.